Everyone in Hardin's Bluff thought they knew what Elena Cross was. A broke widow with a breadbasket and too much pride. They watched her haul firewood alone, turn down 7 marriage proposals in 8 months, and sell loaves from a fence post just to keep the lights on, and they shook their heads and called her stubborn. Then Damian Ashford, the man who owned more Wyoming land than most people could ride across in a day, started showing up at her door every Saturday morning. The town didn't know what to do with that, so they did what small towns do. They talked. They said she was desperate. They said he had lost his mind. They said it would end badly for both of them. Not one person thought to ask what was hidden beneath the floorboards of that little house. Not one person imagined that a 30-year-old deed and a dead surveyor's confession letters were sitting quietly in the dark, waiting, and that the stubborn widow and the rich rancher everyone was busy judging were about to walk into the biggest land fraud case the territory had ever seen, with nothing but the truth and everything to lose. If this story finds you tonight, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Elena's story travels. Stay with me. It begins now. The morning Elena Cross burned her 3rd loaf of bread in a row, she didn't cry. She stood at the open oven door and stared at the blackened crust for a long moment, then carried it outside and set it on the fence post for the crows. They could have it. She wasn't hungry anyway. That was October. The aspens had gone gold and were already starting to let go, dropping leaves in slow spirals across the yard she never quite managed to keep up with anymore. Thomas had been the one who raked. Thomas had been the one who did a lot of things, and the list of what he used to handle had grown so long in the 8 months since his death that Elena sometimes caught herself standing in the middle of a task she didn't know how to finish, holding a tool she wasn't sure how to use, staring at a problem Thomas would have solved in 20 minutes. The ranch was gone. That had become clear by March, when the creditors started appearing at the door with paperwork she hadn't known existed. Debts Thomas had accumulated quietly, over years, without telling her, borrowing against land they didn't fully own to fund ventures that hadn't worked out. She didn't blame him for it. She had blamed him for about 2 weeks, then stopped, because blaming a dead man felt like screaming into wind. It didn't change anything. The papers were real. The debts were real. The sheriff who came in April to hand her the foreclosure notice had been genuinely apologetic, and that had somehow made it worse. What she had left was the small house at the eastern edge of Hardin's Bluff that had belonged to her grandmother, Ruth Calloway, who had died the winter before Thomas and left it to Elena outright with no debts attached. It was not much. 2 rooms, a root cellar, a wood stove that listed slightly to the left, and a 1/4 acre of hard Wyoming ground. But it was hers. That mattered more than she had expected it to. She had moved in with $17, a cast iron skillet, and her grandmother's sourdough starter, a clay jar of living culture that Ruth had kept fed and active for 30 years. Elena had learned to bake from Ruth when she was 9 years old, standing on a step stool at this same table. And she had never entirely stopped. When everything else had been stripped away, she found herself returning to bread the way some people return to an old habit they thought they'd outgrown. Not because she had any particular plan, just because she knew how to do it, and doing something she knew how to do was the only way she could get through a morning without sitting down in the middle of the floor. By May, she was selling loaves out of a basket at the edge of the market road on Saturday mornings. By June, she had a small handwritten sign. By August, she had a list of regular customers who sent their children to the door with coins before she even made it to the road. It was not a living. It was close enough to a living that she could keep going, which was the only standard she was holding herself to. The town, for its part, had opinions. Hardin's Bluff was the kind of place where people were generally decent to your face and thoroughly uncharitable behind your back, and Elena had grown up there and understood this about it without taking it personally. She had known most of these people since childhood. She knew which women were kind and which ones were merely polite. She knew which men respected her and which ones were waiting for her to fail in some specific, visible way so they could feel justified in not offering help earlier. She had developed a fine-tuned awareness of the difference, and it served her. The respectable sympathy lasted about 3 months. Then people began to grow impatient with her grief or her independence or both. She was never entirely sure which one bothered them more. The widows who had remarried within a year were held up as examples. The ones who hadn't were discussed in a particular tone that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite judgment, but lived somewhere uncomfortable between the two. Elena received 7 marriage proposals in the first 8 months after Thomas died. She turned all 7 down, not because she was still in love with Thomas. She was. But that wasn't the primary reason. She turned them down because she looked at each man who asked and could see exactly what her life would become if she said yes, and none of those lives were ones she wanted. Gerald Hatch needed a housekeeper and had decided a wife was cheaper. Robert Finney had a drinking problem he had not mentioned and a temper his previous wife had mentioned privately to Elena before she died. The others were variations on themes she had already examined and found wanting. She was 28 years old. She had already spent 5 years in a marriage that had turned out to be hiding things from her. She was not prepared to walk into another arrangement without understanding what she was walking into. So she kept baking, and the town kept talking, and Elena kept her back straight and her opinions to herself, and got through each day until she got through enough of them that they began to feel like something she had chosen rather than something that was happening to her. That was more or less where things stood on the first Saturday in November when Damien Ashford appeared at the end of her road. She saw him before he reached her. Hard not to. He was on a bay horse that cost more than her house, wearing a coat that was expensive in the specific way that didn't announce itself, riding with the loose ease of a man who had been in the saddle his whole life. She had seen him before, from a distance, the way you see men like that in a town this size. At the bank, at the feed store, occasionally at the edge of some gathering where his presence reorganized the room without him doing anything in particular to cause it. Damien Ashford was 41 years old, had built the largest cattle operation in the territory starting from almost nothing at age 22, and was considered by most of Hardin's Bluff to be either an example of what hard work could achieve or evidence that the world was unfair depending on which end of the economic spectrum you were standing on. He pulled his horse up at the edge of her yard and sat there for a moment, and Elena looked at him with the flat, patient expression she had developed for situations she hadn't decided how to respond to yet. "Something I can help you with?" she said. He tilted his head slightly. "Smelled bread." "Most people do." "From halfway down the road." He said it like he was still working out whether to be impressed or skeptical. "Sourdough? My grandmother's recipe." She didn't elaborate. She wasn't sure why she mentioned the grandmother at all. Maybe because the bread felt like it needed context, or maybe because she was still not quite accustomed to thinking of it as hers instead of Ruth's. He dismounted, tied his horse to the fence post with a practiced ease, and came to the basket she'd set out on the low table near the road. He looked at the loaves for a moment. She had 4 that morning, golden brown and cracked across the top the way good sourdough does when the crust sets right. And then he picked one up and turned it over in his hands with the kind of attention that told her he actually knew what he was looking at. "How much?" he asked. 10 cents? He paid her. He didn't say anything else, just tucked the loaf under his arm and walked back to his horse. Then he paused with one hand on the saddle and looked back at her. "It's a good recipe," he said. "I know," Elena said. He almost smiled. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, and then he mounted and rode back down the road. She watched him go and then went back inside to check on the next batch. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the 4th week, Elena had started counting on it in the way she counted on things she didn't want to admit she counted on. Not because of the 10 cents, though the 10 cents mattered. Because he arrived at 8 in the morning, stayed for approximately 6 minutes, asked 1 or 2 questions about the bread that were actual questions rather than conversation openers, paid, and left. He never tried to extend the interaction beyond what she'd established. He never offered unsolicited opinions about her situation. He behaved, in short, like a customer who had come for the bread. It took her 4 weeks to realize how unusual that was. The 5th Saturday, something went wrong with her wood stove. The flue had been drawing badly all week, and that morning it stopped drawing altogether. And when she opened the oven, she found her loaves half-baked and the kitchen full of smoke. She had all 4 loaves out on the fence in the cold air when Damien arrived, trying to salvage what she could, and she told him flatly that she had nothing to sell today. He looked at the loaves. He looked at the stovepipe where it exited through the wall. He looked at the chimney from the yard. "Flue caps come loose," he said. "See that?" He pointed to where the tin cap that kept rain and wind out of the chimney had tilted at an angle that was blocking the draw. "Wind must have shifted it. Happens with these older setups." I know what's wrong with it, Elena said, which was a slight exaggeration. She had suspected it was the cap but hadn't been certain. Do you have a ladder? In the barn. She expected him to say he'd send someone to fix it. That was what men like him did. They delegated. Instead, he walked to the barn, found the ladder himself after 2 minutes of searching in a space he'd never entered before, and spent the next 15 minutes on her roof adjusting the cap, while she stood below in the cold and watched him work with the unsettled feeling of someone who had prepared for a particular kind of interaction and gotten a different one entirely. The stove drew fine after that. The half-baked loaves were a loss, but she put them in the oven again, and they came out edible, if not her best work. She brought 2 of them to the fence when he came back down. I can't sell these, she said. They're not right. But if you want them for your hands, they're yours. He stood there for a moment with the off loaves in his arms. She had the distinct impression he was deciding how to respond to being given something, which was interesting because it meant no one gave him things very often. Thank you, he said. Not elaborately, just the 2 words. Don't thank me, they're second quality. Still bread. She looked at him for a moment. Do you want coffee? I've got a pot on. She didn't know why she said it. The words came out before she'd decided to say them, and then they were out and she couldn't pull them back, and she watched his face carefully to see if he took it as something it wasn't intended to be. He didn't seem to. If you're offering, he said. They sat on her porch for 40 minutes. The temperature was about 30 degrees and neither of them moved inside. She wasn't sure why. The porch just seemed right, like sitting inside might mean something that the porch didn't. She brought out 2 mugs, and they drank the coffee and talked about the winter, about the cattle prices, about what the spring was likely to bring, and it was the first conversation she'd had in months that felt like 2 people actually talking to each other rather than one person managing another person's expectations. He left at 9:40. She went back inside and stood at the kitchen counter for a while, not doing anything particular, thinking about how little she had expected this morning to go the way it had. Yet, by December, the town had noticed. She had expected that and planned for it accordingly. What she hadn't entirely anticipated was the specific shape the gossip would take, not the whispers that she was pursuing him for his money, though those came, but the ones suggesting he was doing it out of pity. That particular angle surprised her, and not pleasantly. Margaret Teller, who ran the dry goods store and had a precise working knowledge of everyone's business, mentioned it to Elena's face with the particular brand of friendliness that is indistinguishable from cruelty. People are worried about you, Elena. A man like that coming around every week. You know how it looks. How does it look? Elena asked. Margaret's mouth went slightly thin. She had not expected to be asked directly. Like he feels sorry for you. Like maybe you're encouraging it. He buys bread, Elena said. Same as you. I don't come every week. Maybe you should. It's good bread. She walked out before Margaret could regroup. She was shaking slightly by the time she reached the street. Not from anger exactly, more from the particular exhaustion of having to defend something she hadn't done wrong against people who had already decided what they were going to believe. She told Damien about it the following Saturday. Not because she'd planned to, but because he arrived in the middle of a mood she wasn't successfully hiding and asked, bluntly, what was wrong, and she found she was too tired to construct a polite deflection. He listened without interrupting. He had a quality she'd noticed early and kept noticing. He didn't fill silences unnecessarily. He let her finish. Is any of it true? He asked. Which part? The pity part. She looked at him. Is it? No. He said it flatly, without defensiveness, which was the only way she would have believed it. I come because I like the bread, and I like talking to you. That's all there is to it. Then we don't have a problem, she said. He nodded once. No, he agreed. We don't. But the town had a problem, and it made that clear in ways that escalated through December at a pace Elena tracked with the careful attention she applied to most things that might require action. The first sign she hadn't taken seriously enough was the night someone left a dead rabbit on her front step. She'd assumed it was an accident. Animals turned up dead in odd places in winter, it happened. But then Robert Finney, the second man whose proposal she'd refused, said something at the market that was too specific about her firewood arrangements to have been guesswork. Then a piece of the fence she'd repaired the previous month was broken again, cleanly, in a way that didn't look like weather. She mentioned none of this to Damien. She wasn't sure at that point whether telling him would change anything or just add weight to a situation she hadn't fully evaluated yet. Then came the Sunday afternoon when three men she knew by name but not well, associates of Fletcher Graves, who ran a small but influential alliance of property owners in the county, came to her door and suggested, with the thin politeness of men who expected compliance, that she might want to think about relocating before winter got worse. Relocating to where, she said. The one who seemed to be in charge, a heavy-set man named Court Bellamy, smiled in a way that didn't reach anything above his cheekbones. Somewhere more suitable to your circumstances, Mrs. Cross. My circumstances seem fine to me. The thing is, ma'am, this particular piece of property, your grandmother's place, it's been under some question in terms of the proper surveys. We've had some surveyors taking a second look at the eastern border parcels, and it may be that the lines here aren't quite what people assumed. She went very still, not visibly. She was good at not letting things show, but something in her chest went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when she encountered something that mattered. I'd need to see that in writing, she said. Naturally. Bellamy nodded. We'll have something drawn up. We just wanted to come by in person first, out of respect for you and your grandmother's memory. They left, and Elena stood in the doorway and watched them ride back down the road, and then she went inside and began, very systematically, to go through every drawer and box and folder in the house, looking for her grandmother's property documents. She had gone through most of Ruth's belongings when she inherited the house, but quickly, out of grief and necessity. She had not been looking for anything in particular, just trying to understand what she had and what she needed to deal with. Now she went through everything again, slowly, and what she found in the first hour was that Ruth had been meticulous. Every receipt, every letter, every piece of paper that had ever arrived at this address was in labeled envelopes in the bottom drawer of the bureau in the back room. The property deed was there. She sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time, reading it carefully, reading the legal description twice. The house and quarter acre were clearly described and clearly Ruth's. But there was a second document in the same envelope, older, written in a different hand, a survey map with handwritten notations that she didn't have the knowledge to fully interpret, referencing a parcel of 40 acres with a boundary marker she didn't recognize the location of. She turned it over. On the back in Ruth's writing were the words, Callaway Grant Land, Original Survey, 1847. See Harlan Voss, Redisputed Claim. Elena sat with that for a long time. She had no idea who Harlan Voss was. She had no context for the 1847 survey, but she knew what the men at her door that afternoon had been looking for, and she knew it wasn't what Court Bellamy had described, and she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had already been robbed of one piece of property and had learned what that robbery looked like in retrospect, that she was standing at the edge of the same thing happening again. She folded the documents carefully and put them inside her grandmother's Bible, which she pressed flat between the mattress and the bed frame, and then she baked bread until it was dark outside. Not because she was hungry, but because bread was the thing she did when she needed to think. December turned hard. The cold came down from the north in the way it does in Wyoming, not gradually, but all at once, like a door slamming. Elena kept the fire going and the bread coming and the documents hidden and the worry quiet behind her face, which she had gotten good at. Damien arrived every Saturday. By January, he was also arriving on Wednesdays sometimes, not for bread, just to work on whatever needed working on. He replaced 2 fence rails she'd been putting off because the wood was expensive. He found a gap in the roof above the root cellar and patched it before the next snow. He brought his own tools and did it without asking permission or announcing it in advance, which might have annoyed her but didn't, partly because the things he fixed genuinely needed fixing, and partly because he did it and left without extracting any debt from the exchange. She watched how he worked. He was efficient and he was honest. He didn't pretend a bad job was acceptable because he'd done it, and twice she saw him undo something he'd done and start again when it didn't sit right. He wasn't trying to impress her. She appreciated that more than she could easily explain. One Wednesday in mid-January, when they were both on the porch in the cold with coffee after he'd finished reinforcing the gate, he said, without particular lead-up, "What did those men want? The ones who came in November." She looked at him steadily. "What men?" "3 of them, Bellamy and 2 others. My foreman saw them riding from the direction of your place." She was quiet for a moment, deciding. She had known, on some level, that she was going to tell him. She had been waiting until she understood it well enough to explain it clearly, because she had learned, from Thomas, among others, that there was a difference between needing to talk through a problem and actually understanding one, and she preferred to do the latter before the former. They said there were questions about my property lines, she said. He didn't react immediately. He looked out at the field. What kind of questions? Survey questions. They said they were taking another look at the eastern border parcels. Bellamy works for Fletcher Graves, he said. I know. And Graves works for Silas Vaughn. She hadn't known that. You're certain? Reasonably. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. What did you find? She looked at him sharply. He met her gaze and waited. You knew I'd find something, she said. I didn't know. I thought it was possible. He paused. Your grandmother was Ruth Calloway. Yes. I've heard that name in connection with the Eastern Grant lands for a while now. Years, actually. But I didn't have documentation. I didn't know if there was anything left to find. He said it plainly, not apologetically, not asking forgiveness for having been interested in her grandmother's history before he knew her, just accounting for where he was. She went inside and came back with the documents. She sat beside him and spread them on the old table between them and watched his face as he read. He was careful with them, handled the older paper like he knew it was fragile. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the sky for a long moment. 40 acres, he said. That's what it says. If this survey is accurate, and if the 1847 grant held, that land was never legally transferred. Whatever's on it now would be built on a fraudulent claim. That's what I thought, Elena said. I don't know enough law to be certain. I do, he said. Not like a lawyer, but enough. He looked at her. Can I ask you something honestly? You can ask? What do you want to do about it? It was the right question. It was the question she had been asking herself for 2 months, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she needed to be sure the answer was coming from the right place. I want what belongs to my family, she said, not because I need 40 acres. I have enough, but because someone took it, and they're still taking things from other people, and I think I might have what's needed to stop that. He nodded once, didn't dress it up. Then we have work to do. The work was not elegant. It was cold rides to neighboring counties in the dark, going through courthouse records that hadn't been organized in 20 years, following chains of title through 4 and 5 conveyances until the fraudulent transfer appeared like a splice in a rope. Crude, once you knew to look for it, but invisible if you weren't looking. Damien had been looking for a long time and had maps and notes going back years. A private investigation he'd undertaken after his nearest neighbor, an honest rancher named Abel Pruitt, had lost 300 acres to the same scheme and died 6 months later. Some combination of grief and a heart that had already been working too hard. He hadn't talked about Abel Pruitt before. He mentioned him now once, in the spare way he mentioned things that mattered, and Elena understood from the economy of the words that this was personal in a way that had been driving him longer than any business interest. What she had, the deed, the survey map, her grandmother's notation about Harlan Voss, connected threads he'd had no anchor for. The 1847 grant was the origin point. Everything else had grown from it, fraudulent conveyances feeding on fraudulent conveyances, until the network was enormous and the crimes were 30 years deep. She also had Ruth. Not Ruth herself, obviously, but Ruth's habit of documentation, every letter, every receipt, the meticulous filing that Elena had initially read as a character trait and now understood as something more deliberate, more knowing. Ruth had known the land had been taken, she had known it, and she had kept every piece of paper she'd ever received about it, and she had hidden the original survey in a place where Elena would eventually find it. And the notation on the back of that survey, see Harlan Voss read disputed claim, was the last direction her grandmother had left her. Harlan Voss turned out to be dead, had been for 12 years. But he had a son in Cheyenne who turned out to be a lawyer, who turned out to remember his father talking about the Calloway grant, who turned out to have his father's files in a cedar trunk in his office that he'd never gotten around to going through. The three of them spent a very long Saturday going through that cedar trunk, and what came out of it was the documentation that turned a set of plausible claims into an airtight case. By February, Court Bellamy and two of his associates had been seen twice near Elena's property in a way that moved past coincidence into surveillance. She reported it to the sheriff, who wrote it down and did not appear to take significant action, which told her something about the local reach of the network they were untangling. Damien's response was to send two of his own men, not to intimidate, he explained, but simply to make the surveillance visible. People behaved differently when they knew they were being watching someone. He was right. Bellamy stopped coming near the property. But something else happened instead. A formal letter arrived from a land office attorney claiming that a survey discrepancy had been identified and that her grandmother's property might be subject to review. Elena read the letter at the kitchen table with Damien across from her, and she looked up when she finished. "They're trying to get ahead of this," she said. "Yes." He looked at the letter. "They know something's coming. They don't know what or from where, but they're starting to cover ground." "How much time do we have?" He thought about it. "Not a lot. If they get a filing in before we do, even a frivolous one, it complicates the timeline." She set the letter down carefully. "Then let's stop waiting." She said it calmly, but she felt the decision settle into her the way important decisions do when they're right. Not with triumph, but with the quiet relief of something that had been suspended finally coming to rest. They filed in March, in the Territorial District Court, and the papers that went in with their case were so thorough and so carefully sourced that the clerk looked up from reading them and said, with the flat surprise of a man not given to shows of feeling, "You've been working on this for a while." "Long enough," Damien said. Elena said nothing. She looked out the courthouse window at the street and thought about Ruth's bottom drawer, Ruth's careful envelopes, the meticulous record of something that had been taken and never forgotten. Outside, the first thaw was starting. The mud was back, and the birds, and the particular smell of frozen ground giving way that meant the worst of winter was over, and something else was beginning. She had survived it. She wasn't sure yet what came next, but she was standing in it, and that was enough. The bread she baked that evening was the best batch she'd made all winter. The crust right, the crumb open, the tang exactly where she wanted it. She put a loaf on the fence post out of habit and stood on the porch for a while in the cold, and the crows didn't come for it that night, which she took as nothing in particular. Just a fact, like all the other facts, waiting to be part of whatever came after. The filing changed things in ways Elena hadn't fully anticipated. She had expected the opposition to intensify. That was logical. She understood cause and effect. But she hadn't predicted the specific form it would take, which was social rather than legal. Within 2 weeks of the court filing becoming public record, something shifted in the texture of her daily interactions with the town that she could feel before she could name. The market road felt different on Saturday mornings. The women who had always greeted her pleasantly still did, but with a slight delay, a fractional pause before the smile arrived, as if they were checking something internally first. The men were more direct about it. 2 of them crossed the street rather than pass her on the same side, which was so deliberate it was almost comical. Margaret Teller didn't cross the street. She did something worse. She was kind in the specific way that meant she thought Elena was losing. "You're so brave," she said, outside the dry goods store on a Tuesday, with an expression that belonged on someone at a funeral, taking on something like this. "Most people wouldn't." "Most people don't have documentation," Elena said, and went in to buy her flour. It was the sheriff's public statement that did the most damage. He issued it through the County Gazette, 3 paragraphs saying essentially nothing except that the land question was under examination and that residents should not draw premature conclusions. It was worded carefully enough to be technically neutral and colored carefully enough to imply that Elena's claim was the premature conclusion being warned against. She read it twice, folded the paper, and put it in the drawer with the other documents she was keeping track of. Damien read it the same morning at his own kitchen table 3 miles away, and by noon his horse was at her fence. "You saw it," she said, not a question. "He's Vaughn's," Damien said. "Always has been. I knew that. I should have told you earlier." It wouldn't have changed anything. She handed him a mug and they stood in the doorway because neither of them had felt like sitting down since the morning. "We knew we weren't going to have the county behind us. Knowing it and seeing it printed are different things." "Are they?" She said it flatly, not quite agreeing, not quite pushing back. She knew what he meant. There was something about seeing a thing written down that made it realer than it had been in your head, and sometimes realer in that way was worse. But she had been through the ranch. She had been through Thomas dying. She had developed a particular tolerance for things being worse than she'd expected and still having to function. He looked at her for a moment. "How are you doing with it?" The question caught her slightly off guard. Not because it was intrusive, it wasn't. He asked things directly. She had gotten used to that. But because she hadn't asked herself all morning and the answer was not immediately clear. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me in a few days." He nodded. That was something she appreciated about him. He accepted that kind of answer without pushing for a better one. They didn't talk about the statement after that. Instead, he told her he'd had a letter from the Territorial Land Office requesting the original deed for inspection, which they had both expected and had agreed to handle through the Voss family lawyer in Cheyenne, rather than through local channels they didn't trust. He'd already forwarded the request with a note that the document would be available for examination at the courthouse upon 30 days' notice as legally permitted, which would buy them time and establish a paper trail if anyone later claimed they hadn't cooperated. 30 days, she said, probably less. They'll push back, but it gives us room. He set the mug down on the railing. I also got a letter from Abel Pruitt's widow. She had heard the name once before, the neighbor he'd mentioned briefly in January, the one who'd lost land and died not long after. She waited. She's been holding documentation that I didn't know about. Personal correspondence between her husband and a man named Garrison Holt. He was a territorial surveyor in the 1860s. The correspondence describes conversations about the Callaway Grant specifically, about how the boundary markers were physically moved. Elena was quiet for a moment. Someone moved the actual markers. According to Holt's private letters he was apparently too afraid to make public but couldn't bring himself to destroy. Yes. Someone paid him to conduct a fraudulent resurvey in 1864 that shifted the eastern boundary of the Callaway Grant roughly 42 acres to the west. On paper, the land appeared to fall outside the original grant. In reality, it never had. She put her hand flat on the porch railing and held it there. Not because she needed support, just because she needed something solid under her palm while she let that settle. He was paid, she said. Paid and threatened, from what she says. She only found the letters after Abel died, went through his papers, found them in a locked box she didn't have the key for. She forced it open with a fireplace poker. He said that last part with a kind of dry appreciation she understood. She's been sitting on them for 2 years because she didn't know who to trust with them. And she trusts you. She trusts that I'm fighting the same fight her husband died trying to fight. He said it without sentiment, though she could hear the weight underneath it. She's 70 years old and she lives in a 2-room house, and she's been waiting 2 years to give those letters to the right person. Elena looked out at the road. The mud from the thaw was drying in the afternoon air, cracking along the tracks the wagon had left. When are you going to get them? I'm riding out Thursday. I'm coming. He looked at her. It's a full day's ride. I know what a full day's ride is. He didn't argue. She appreciated that too. The way he registered an objection once and then dropped it when it became clear there was no ground to argue from. A lot of men kept arguing past that point. Damien understood that she wasn't someone you argued past. I'll bring an extra horse, he said, set. The Pruitt place was in a shallow valley east of Harker Creek, surrounded by cottonwoods that were just starting to bud. The house was small and kept, not elaborately, but with the careful attention of someone who didn't have much to spend but wouldn't tolerate disorder. There were chickens in a proper run and a kitchen garden with the first green shoots of something coming up, and an old dog of indeterminate breed asleep on the porch step who opened one eye when they arrived and then closed it again. Mabel Pruitt was not what Elena had built in her imagination on the ride out. She had expected something more fragile, a woman diminished by 2 years of holding a secret alone. What she found was a woman with short white hair and hands that were still strong from decades of work, who greeted them at the door with the manner of someone who had been expecting them and had things to do afterward. Come in, she said. Coffee's made. She didn't make small talk. Elena liked her immediately. The letters were in a tin box on the kitchen table, already out. She had clearly laid them out before they arrived, organized in a particular order Elena recognized from Ruth's filing habits, the kind of order that meant the person had read them many times and knew their contents completely. Mabel poured coffee and sat down across from them and said, without preamble, Garrison Holt was afraid of the same people Abel was afraid of. He just had different reasons to be afraid, because he had done something Abel never did. He'd let himself be bought. She said it without cruelty, just as a fact she had made her peace with. He spent the rest of his life being sorry about it. These letters are how sorry men talk to themselves when they can't talk to anyone else. Elena picked up the first letter carefully. The handwriting was cramped, the paper old and slightly water-stained at the bottom left corner where the seal had failed at some point. She read while Damien and Mabel talked, and what she read was a man in stages of collapse, a surveyor who had agreed to falsify records for what he'd been told was a routine boundary adjustment, who had only understood the full scope of what he'd done months later when he saw the Calloway family displaced from land he now knew they'd legally owned. The letters weren't addressed to anyone. They were the written equivalent of talking to yourself at 3 a.m, the kind of unburdening that happens when a thing is too heavy to carry and too dangerous to put down where anyone can see it. The final letter had the thing they needed, a precise description of what had been changed and how, including the original coordinates of the boundary markers before they were moved, coordinates that matched the 1847 survey and Ruth's documents with a precision that was not coincidence. Elena set the letter down. This corroborates the original survey exactly. I know, Mabel said. You understood what it meant. Abel was trying to prove the same thing from a different direction. Mabel wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. He didn't have your grandmother's deed. He didn't know about the 1847 survey. He knew the land had been taken, but he couldn't prove the mechanism. These letters described the mechanism, but they needed the original survey to anchor them. She looked at Elena steadily. He would have found his way to you eventually. He just ran out of time. Elena sat with that for a moment. She thought about Thomas running out of time in a different way, for different reasons, and about Ruth keeping her careful envelopes for 30 years, and about the way things you can't finish sometimes find their way to the person who can. I'll get them back, she said, not just to Mabel, but because she needed to say it out loud. The Pruitt land. It's in the same network. We can make the same argument. Mabel's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it settled, like a knot coming slightly looser. That was never what I was thinking about, she said. I'm 70. I don't need 40 acres. I need to know Abel was right. He was right. I know. She picked up her coffee. But it helps to have someone else say it. They rode back in the long April dusk, not talking much. The letters were in Elena's saddlebag wrapped in oilcloth. She was aware of their weight in the specific way you're aware of something irreplaceable. Not anxious exactly, just present to the fact that it mattered. Halfway back, Damien said, You didn't have to offer the Pruitt land. I know. We don't have a case for it yet. Not in the same filing. We will, she said. After. He was quiet for a minute. After is a ways off still. I'm aware. She kept her eyes on the road. It's still right. Mabel didn't come out and say it, but Abel spent years on this and it cost him. You don't let that stand just because it's inconvenient to fix. He didn't say anything immediately. She wasn't sure if he agreed or was still working it out, and she was comfortable either way. She had not made the offer looking for his approval. She had made it because it was correct, and what was correct was not subject to debate based on convenience. You do this thing, he said finally. She looked over at him. What thing? Decide something's right and then just act on it. No negotiation. Is that a problem? No. He sounded slightly thoughtful. It's just uncommon. She considered that. Thomas wasn't like that, she said, not bitterly, just as a true thing she was noting. Thomas thought everything through from every angle until sometimes he couldn't act at all. I used to think I should be more like that. Take more time, consider more possibilities. What changed your mind? Watching what happened to things he couldn't decide about. She paused. Some things don't improve with more consideration. They just decay. He didn't respond to that, and she didn't expect him to. It wasn't the kind of thing that wanted a response. It was just something she had learned and said out loud because the evening and the road, and his particular kind of listening, had made it feel like the right time to say it. The lights of Hardin's Bluff appeared ahead of them, small and scattered in the early dark. She thought about the letters in her bag and the drawer at home where the deed lived and the cedar trunk in Cheyenne and Abel Pruitt's widow with her 2-room house and her kitchen garden and her patient, undefeated knowledge that her husband had been right. It was a lot to carry. but it was real, and it was hers. And she was getting better at knowing the difference between weight that broke you and weight that built you into the shape of the thing you were going to need to become. The escalation, when it came in full, arrived from a direction she should have anticipated and hadn't. It was a Saturday, late May, warm enough that she'd propped the front door open while she baked, and she was in the middle of her second batch when she heard wheels on the road and looked up to see a carriage she didn't recognize, too fine for anyone local, stopping at the edge of her property. The man who stepped out was not Court Bellamy, not anyone from Fletcher Graves's circle. He was perhaps 60, thin, with the quality of someone who has spent decades operating in rooms where other people are nervous and learned to perform calm so completely it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. He wore a gray coat and a hat that had been expensive when it was made, which had been some years ago, and he carried a leather case with a brass clasp. She came to the door with her hands still white with flour and looked at him across the yard. "Mrs. Cross," he said, "my name is Silas Vaughn." She had expected him at some point. She had not expected him to come himself, which meant he was either very confident or more worried than Bellamy had let on. She wiped her hands on her apron and came down the steps. "Mr. Vaughn?" He looked at her in the considering way of a man who is accustomed to assessing people quickly and revising downward. He revised her upward, she could tell. Something shifted in his expression by a fraction, a small recalibration. "I wonder if we might speak," he said. "We're speaking." He looked at the open yard around them with the slight discomfort of a man who preferred walls. "Privately." "This is private enough for me," she said. He accepted that without visible irritation, which told her he was better at this than most of his representatives. He opened the leather case and produced a document, thick, official-looking, with a seal she recognized as territorial. "The Land Office has completed its preliminary review of the boundary survey question," he said. "I'm here to offer a resolution before this proceeds further." She looked at the document without taking it. "What kind of resolution?" "The parcel in question, the 40 acres your filing references, has been under active commercial use and development for 11 years. The current holders have significant investment in it. Displacing that investment would be disruptive to the county's economic interests." He said it the way lawyers say things, not as a proposition, but as an established fact. "We're prepared to offer you a fair market settlement for your grandmother's historical claim, compensating you for the value of the land as it stood at the time of the original survey, plus a consideration for the inconvenience of the current situation." "What's the number?" He named it. It was not a small number. It was a number designed to be large enough that saying no to it would feel unreasonable. Elena looked at it and felt nothing about the money. What she felt was a very clear reading of what the offer meant, which was that he was more worried than she'd known, and that the case was stronger than he was letting on, and that he had come here himself because he had assessed the threat as significant enough to warrant personal attention. "Who else has been offered this?" she said. He blinked slightly. "I'm not sure I follow." "The Pruitt land, the Hendricks parcel, the 3 grants in Cotter County that appear in your company's acquisition records from the 1870s. She had been reading. She had been reading everything she could find for 3 months. "Have you offered settlements to all of them, or just the ones with surviving documentation?" The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long, which was 4 seconds longer than he'd intended to pause. "The offer is for your claim specifically," he said. His voice was still controlled, but it was a different kind of controlled, the kind that is working harder. "Then the answer is no." He looked at her for a moment. "Mrs. Cross, the litigation process is long and expensive. Even with the documentation you have, a territorial court case could take years. The stress of that—" "You came here yourself," she said. "You got in a carriage and came out to a widow's house to offer her money to go away. That tells me something about how worried you are, and that tells me something about how strong our case is." She took the document he was holding and handed it back to him without looking at it again. "If you want to resolve this, you can do it in court. That's where we'll be." He put the document back in the case with the deliberate care of a man who is not used to being dismissed, and has trained himself not to show what that costs him. He closed the clasp. "I hope you understand what you're choosing," he said. "I do," she said. "Better than you think." He got back in the carriage, and it turned on the road and went back the way it had come. Elena stood in the yard until it was out of sight, and then she went inside and took the loaves out of the oven because the bread didn't care about Silas Vaughn, and neither, she decided, was she going to. She told Damien that evening. She had sent word with the neighbor's boy, and he arrived before dark, and she told him everything Vaughn had said, and the number, and what she had said back. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back in the chair across from her and looked at her steadily. "He came himself," he said. "Yes." "That's not nothing. Men like that don't make personal visits for things they think they're going to win." "That's what I thought." She poured more coffee into both mugs. He mentioned the stress of litigation. Something moved across Damien's face at that. Not anger exactly, but a quiet tightening. "He was trying to scare you. Badly." She sat down. It would have worked on someone who had less to lose. "You already lost the ranch," Damien said. Not unkindly, just acknowledging it. "I already lost the ranch," she agreed. "Silas Vaughn threatening me with a long legal fight is like threatening someone who's been swimming that they might get wet." She looked at her coffee. "I don't have much to protect. That makes me harder to threaten, not easier." He was quiet for a moment. She couldn't always read what he was thinking. He didn't perform his thoughts the way some people did, filling every silence with evidence of their own processing. He thought, and then he spoke, and the gap between the two was his business. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "I had a visit too, not Vaughn. Two men I've done business with for years, Reed Palliser and Tom Garrow. They came to the ranch this morning, told me I was making a mistake, that my involvement in this case was going to damage my reputation with the banking community in Cheyenne, that certain lending relationships might become complicated." She looked at him. "And?" "I told them they could take their banking relationships to someone who needed them more." "Do you need them?" He considered this honestly. "Less than they think. I've been careful with the ranch's finances. I don't carry the debt most operations my size carry. It's why I could afford to make enemies of people who control credit." He said it without pride, just as a practical fact. "I built it that way, partly because I could see this kind of thing coming eventually. You don't spend years investigating a fraud network without understanding that the network has reach." Elena sat with that. There was something she wanted to say and was working out whether to say it. "You've been building toward this for a long time," she said finally. "Before you found me. Before you knew about the deed." "Yes." "Abel Pruitt. Partly Abel, partly—" He stopped, picked up his coffee, and set it down again. "I grew up without land. My father worked land that belonged to other men his whole life and died with nothing to show for it. I know what it looks like when a system is designed to keep it that way. When I got old enough and rich enough to do something about it, I started doing something about it." He shrugged slightly, which on him was a large gesture. "It took a long time to find the thread that would unravel the whole thing. Your grandmother had it." "Ruth kept everything," Elena said. "I used to think she was just thorough, the way some old women are. Now I think she knew." "I think she knew," he said. "I think she hoped someone would find it after she was gone." Elena looked at her hands on the table. "She could have told me herself." "Maybe she didn't want you carrying it while you were still young enough to do something stupid with it," he said, which was such an unexpectedly accurate reading of her grandmother's logic that she almost laughed. "That's Ruth," she said. "Exactly." Outside, the spring dark had fully settled, and there was a wind coming off the hills that moved through the cottonwoods and the sound she associated with something turning over, one season releasing its hold and the next one beginning to establish itself. She had been aware for some weeks of something changing between them, in the way she was aware of the flu cap. Obvious in retrospect, gradual in approach, not something you could pinpoint the start of. She didn't name it. It was too early to name, and she was too cautious to name things before she understood them. And she had learned from Thomas that the wanting of something could make you see it more clearly than it was. She would wait and see what it actually was before she decided what to do about it. What she knew was this. In the 8 months since he'd first stopped at her fence, nobody had talked to her the way he talked to her. Not just honestly, though that was part of it, but as if her conclusions mattered and her anger was valid and her decisions were hers to make without requiring his approval before she made them. She had not known, until she had it regularly, how hungry she'd been for exactly that. "What happens if we lose?" she said. He looked at her. You want an honest answer or a useful one? Are they different? The honest answer is we might. These things aren't certain. The useful answer is that I've never worked a case this well documented and still lost, and I don't plan to start. That's still not a guarantee. No, he said, nothing is. But we have Ruth's deed, the original survey, Holt's letters, Abel Pruitt's notes, 3 years of my own investigation, and a lawyer in Cheyenne who has won 6 similar cases in the last decade. He met her eyes. And we have you, who looked Silas Vaughn in the face today and handed his settlement offer back to him, which is not something most people would have done. She was quiet for a moment. I almost took it, she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. For about 10 seconds, I looked at that number and thought about what it would mean to not have to fight anymore, to just be done with it. She was looking at the table now. Then I thought about who would get the land, and who else they'd take it from after me, and I couldn't. I know, he said. Does it get easier, saying no to the thing that would make it simpler? He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about things she actually meant. No, he said. But you get clearer on why you're saying no, and that helps. She nodded slowly. It did help. Not enough to make it easy, but enough to make it survivable, which was the standard she held most things to. The wind moved the cottonwoods again outside, and the lamplight held them both in the small, warm circle it made in the kitchen, and the bread she'd baked that morning sat on the counter cooling, and the documents in the drawer held all their patient, careful truths, and the case was still being built, and the fight was still ahead of them, and she was still there, and so was he. And for tonight, that was what it was. The summer that followed Vaughn's visit was the longest Elena could remember, and not because of the heat. The heat was bad enough. July came in dry and mean, the kind of dry that cracked the ground in long seams and made the horses restless and turned the water in the creek down to a thin, resentful trickle. Elena's garden suffered. Her sourdough starter behaved oddly in the temperature swings, rising too fast some mornings and collapsing before she could get it into the oven, and she spent 2 weeks adjusting her schedule to bake before dawn when the kitchen was still cool enough to work in. These were manageable problems. She had managed harder ones. What made the summer long was the waiting. The territorial court had accepted their filing in March. It was now July, and the case had not been assigned a hearing date. Their lawyer in Cheyenne, a compact, precise man named Arlo Finch, who had the manner of someone who had learned long ago not to let impatience show in his profession, wrote every 3 weeks with updates that contained less information than the letter's length implied. The land office had submitted a response. The response had been reviewed. A procedural question had been raised regarding the admissibility of survey documents older than 30 years. The procedural question was being examined. Elena read each letter twice and filed it in the drawer and went back to her bread. Damien handled the waiting differently. He worked. She had noticed this about him before, that he converted anxiety into motion, which was not the worst way to handle it, though it meant that when he was worried, he was also very busy. He had 3 new hands on the ranch by June, 2 of them set to work specifically on cataloging the additional land fraud cases that had emerged once word of their filing became known. It turned out that the Callaway Grant case was not the first story of this kind to surface in the territory. It was just the first one with documentation strong enough to matter in court. People had been coming to Damien quietly for months. A rancher from 2 counties over who had lost a water access easement through paperwork he'd never been shown. A widow in Cotter County whose late husband's original deed had vanished from the county recorder's office sometime in the early 1870s. A family of 3 brothers who had been farming land for 16 years and discovered that the parcel had been quietly retitled under a Vaught company name without their knowledge. Damien organized their stories. He couldn't file for them all. That would come later, if it came at all. But he documented each one, and the documentation built a picture that was becoming too large and too consistent to be anything but what it was. Elena met some of them. They came to Damien's ranch, and she was there sometimes for those conversations. And what she found in each story was the same structure underneath the specific details. A legitimate claim, a moment of fraudulent paperwork, a gradual pressure applied until the rightful owner gave up or died. The mechanism was always the same, only the names changed. She started keeping her own notes, not because Damien didn't have his. He did, organized and thorough, but because she found she understood the cases differently than he did. He looked at them as legal problems. She looked at them as things that had happened to people, and the distinction mattered when you were trying to explain them to a judge who had never been poor and would need to understand what it felt like to have your land taken before he could fully understand why the taking was wrong. She said something like this to Damien one evening in late June, sitting on his porch because he had invited her to dinner and she had come and the dinner had been fine, and they were now on the porch in the warm dark with what remained of the coffee. "You think about the legal elements," she said. "That's right, that's what wins cases. But someone's going to have to stand in front of that judge and make him feel the weight of this before the law part means anything." Damien looked at her. "Finch is good at closing arguments." "Finch wasn't there," she said. "I was. Mabel Pruitt was. The Hendricks brothers were." She looked at her coffee. "The law is important, Damien, but you can have every document in perfect order and still lose if the judge thinks the people who were wronged were somehow careless about being wronged." He was quiet for a moment. "You think that's a risk?" "I think territorial judges don't always come from backgrounds where they understand what it means to not have a lawyer when someone hands you paperwork. They assume a reasonable man would have caught the problem earlier. We need to explain why a reasonable man didn't catch it. Not because he was stupid, but because he was operating in a system that was specifically designed to be impossible to catch from the inside." Damien set his cup down on the porch rail. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since March." "You didn't say anything." "I was still thinking." She met his eyes. "I'm done thinking. I want to talk to Finch about how we structure the narrative in the courtroom. Not just the evidence, the story." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had learned over these months to read. Not agreement exactly, but the particular quality of attention that meant he was genuinely reconsidering something rather than just waiting for her to finish. "I'll write to Finch," he said. "I'll write to Finch," she said. "It'll come across differently from me." "You're right," he said without hesitation, which still occasionally surprised her even now. God. The letter she wrote to Arlo Finch was 3 pages long and covered what she understood about how the fraud had operated psychologically, not just legally. How the victims had been chosen specifically because they were isolated, or grieving, or stretched thin, or all 3 at once. How the offers and pressures came at moments when a person's capacity to resist was lowest. How the paperwork was designed to look official without being official, to move fast enough that the person signing didn't have time to read it properly. And how the follow-up documentation, the filings, the resurveys, the county recorder entries, was handled by people on Vaughn's payroll who ensured that the paper trail looked clean from the outside. She did not write it as a lawyer. She wrote it as someone who had read every one of Holt's letters and sat across from Mabel Pruitt and listened to the Hendricks brothers describe the afternoon they'd found the retitled deed. She wrote it the way Ruth would have written it, carefully, specifically, with the kind of detail that made an abstraction into a thing you could hold in your hand. Finch wrote back in 10 days. His letter was shorter than usual and more direct than any he had sent before. "Mrs. Cross, what you have described is what I have been trying to find the language for across 6 similar cases. I believe your framing should be central to the courtroom presentation. Can you come to Cheyenne in August?" She could. She went. Cheyenne in August was hotter than Hardin's Bluff, and considerably noisier. She had been there twice before, once as a child, once after Thomas died. For estate business, she had navigated alone and badly. This time she took the morning stage and arrived before noon, and went directly to Finch's office on the 2nd floor of a building on the main commercial street that smelled of paper and the particular drywood smell of a space that has held a lot of concentrated work. Finch was about 50, with a narrow face and the eyes of someone who had spent decades reading very small print under poor light. He shook her hand with the brisk formality of a man who respected competence and conveyed that respect through not wasting time. "I've read your letter 4 times, he said, settling across from her at the desk. "Each time I noticed something I missed." "I wrote it 4 times, she said. "Each time I noticed something I'd missed." He nodded once, which she took as professional appreciation. He had the case files spread across the desk between them. She recognized the organization from Damien's notes, though Finch had added considerable legal annotation in a cramped hand along the margins. They spent the afternoon going through it, and what emerged from that conversation was something she hadn't fully anticipated. Finch had been uncertain, she realized, not about the evidence, but about the presentation. He had the what and the how. He had needed someone who had been there to tell him the why in human terms. By late afternoon, they had a structure. The case would open with the 1847 Callaway grant, the original, legitimate claim, documented and clear. It would then move through the 1864 resurvey, using Holt's letters to show the mechanism of the fraud at the moment it happened. It would establish a pattern using the additional cases as a network, not as separate claims since they weren't all filing separately, but as evidence that the same mechanism had been applied consistently, deliberately, by the same people over decades. And it would close with what Elena had articulated in her letter: the human architecture of the fraud, the way it had been designed to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of the people it targeted. Vaughn's defense will argue each case is isolated, Finch said, that the resurveys were legitimate, the paperwork was standard, any errors were clerical. He'll say my grandmother failed to contest the resurvey in 1864, Elena said. He'll make it her failure. Yes. Then we need to show what contesting a survey in 1864 would have required of a woman in her position, what the process was, what it cost, who controlled it. She looked at the table. Ruth wasn't passive. She documented everything. She held on to the deed and the original survey for 30 years. She wasn't someone who gave up. She paused. She was someone who understood that fighting in 1864 with no money and no legal recourse was going to lose, and chose instead to wait until the evidence was strong enough to win. Finch looked at her for a moment. Can you prove that? I can prove she kept every document. I can let the jury draw the conclusion. It's a good strategy, he said. It requires you to be in the courtroom when we present it. I know. It will be uncomfortable. I've had an uncomfortable year, Elena said. I've gotten better at it. He almost smiled, the way very serious people sometimes almost smile when they are genuinely amused but feel the professional moment doesn't fully permit it. I'll have the amended filing ready by the first week of September, he said, with your additions. The hearing request will go in at the same time. If the court cooperates, he paused because courts did not always cooperate. We may have a date by November. November. 4 months. She had been holding this since March. She could hold it 4 more months. She took the evening stage back and arrived home after midnight and went to bed without lighting the lamp and lay there in the dark for a while, not sleeping, looking at the dark shape of the ceiling and thinking about Ruth sitting in this same house 30 years ago, holding the same deed, knowing the same things, understanding that the time wasn't right yet. The patience required for that was something Elena had not fully appreciated before this year. She was beginning to understand it now. August turned into September without the heat breaking. Elena baked and sold bread and kept her notes and waited for letters from Finch, and did not tell the town anything, which was difficult because the town was still speculating openly, and some of what it was speculating had gotten close enough to accurate to be unsettling. The new source of the speculation was a man named Porter Dills, who wrote the weekly column in the County Gazette and had apparently decided that the land question was interesting enough to investigate. He had written 2 pieces already, one in July that was mostly accurate but thin on specifics, and one in August that had more detail than Elena was comfortable with, and that mentioned her by name in connection with the court filing. She didn't know where he was getting his information. She had 3 theories: someone in the county recorder's office, someone in Finch's orbit, or someone close to Vaughn who was feeding him a version of the story designed to shape public opinion before the hearing. She couldn't rule out any of them. Damien suspected the third. If Vaughn controls the narrative going into court, the judge has context before he's heard evidence, he said. That's not legally supposed to matter. In practice, it sometimes does. So what do we do about it? We could talk to Dills ourselves. She thought about that. He's going to write whatever he's going to write. If we talk to him, at least one version of the truth gets into print. It also lets Vaughn know we're aware of the leak. He already knows we're aware of everything, Elena said. He came to my door himself in May. He's not operating under the impression that we're surprised. Damien conceded that with a slight nod. They agreed to talk to Dills and did the following Tuesday in his cramped office above the Gazette press, where the smell of ink was so thick it was almost a texture. Dills was younger than Elena had expected, maybe 30, with the specific intensity of a man who has chosen a profession that people underestimate and has developed a chip on his shoulder about it that he channels productively. He listened to them for over an hour. He asked good questions, not the kind designed to put words in their mouths, but the kind that showed he had thought about the subject before they arrived. He knew about the resurvey mechanism already. What he didn't know was the full scope of the network, the number of families affected, or the connection to Vaughn's land company that ran through multiple shell operations. When they laid it out for him, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "This is bigger than I thought," he said. "Yes," Damien said. "Can I print it?" "After the hearing," Elena said. "Before, it's prejudicial to both sides. After, you can print everything we've told you, and we'll give you the court documents the day they're entered into record." Dills looked at her. "That's a significant exclusive." "I know what it is." She met his eyes. "In exchange, what you've been printing, the speculative pieces, you pull back. Not stop. Just pull back. Let the facts come out in court where they belong." He thought about it. She could see him weighing the immediate story against the larger one, and she watched him decide that the larger one was worth waiting for. "Agreed," he said. She put out her hand and he shook it, and she felt the small, specific satisfaction of a negotiation handled correctly. Not perfectly, because there was no perfectly, but correctly, which was the only standard worth holding to. The fire happened on a Thursday night in late September. She smelled it before she saw it. Wood smoke on the air at 2 a.m, the wrong time of night for a neighbor's chimney. She was up in 3 seconds and out the door in 5. And what she saw from the front step was a glow on the eastern horizon in the direction of the Hendricks brothers' farm, too orange and too large to be a lamp. She dressed and saddled her horse in the dark and rode toward it, and by the time she arrived, the barn was fully involved, and the 3 brothers were standing in the yard with whatever they'd managed to pull out of it, which wasn't much. One of the brothers, the middle one, Caleb, who she knew best, had burns on his forearms from getting the horses out. He was sitting on the ground with a wet rag on his arms, and the expression of a man who had passed through panic and come out the other side into something emptier. "How did it start?" she asked. "Didn't," he said. She waited for him to elaborate. "It didn't start on its own. Someone set it." She looked at the barn. The fire had been burning long enough and hot enough that there would be nothing left to examine, which was probably the point. "You're sure?" she said. "I'm sure that I don't keep open flame near the barn, and I'm sure I checked the animals at 10, and everything was fine." He looked at the fire with the flat, exhausted eyes of someone who already knew this was a message and was working out what to do about receiving it. They left a piece of fence post near the door, someone's fence post. Had a brand on it. Not mine. "Whose brand?" He looked at her. "I didn't recognize it, but Damien would." She rode to Damien's ranch at 3 a.m. and knocked on the door, and he opened it within a minute, fully dressed, which told her either he hadn't been sleeping or he slept the way men did who had learned to come alert fast. She told him about the barn. She described the brand on the fence post. His jaw tightened. It was one of the few times she had seen a physical reaction cross his face that he didn't manage in the first second. "That's Bellamy's brand," he said. "Court Bellamy." "Yes." "Is he stupid enough to leave his own brand at an arson site?" "No," Damien said. "He's smart enough to know that a fence post with his brand can't be tied to him legally. Anyone could pick up a piece of wood from his property. It's a message, not evidence. It's designed to scare the Hendricks family without giving us anything actionable." She stood in his doorway in the dark and thought about Caleb Hendricks on the ground, with burns on his arms and the empty look in his eyes. "We need to move faster," she said. "I know. If they're willing to burn a barn, they'll be willing to do more." "I know." He came outside, pulling the door shut behind him, and they stood on the porch in the cool September air. "I wrote to Finch yesterday. I asked him to push for an emergency hearing date, citing intimidation of potential witnesses. Will it work? It might. Intimidation of witnesses is a separate offense. It gives the court a reason to accelerate the schedule that doesn't depend on how backed up the docket is." He looked toward the orange glow on the horizon that was just visible from his porch, the Hendricks fire still burning down to nothing. "It also creates a paper trail about what's happening here." "Paper trails?" Elena said, with a tiredness that wasn't quite bitterness. "Everything in this county is paper trails. That's how you win," he said simply. "I know it's slow. I know it's slow too." She looked at the glow. "I just don't want anyone else to get hurt while we're being patient." He didn't offer her reassurance. She appreciated that. False reassurance was something she had no patience for. and he had understood that about her for a long time. The emergency filing went in the following Monday. Finch submitted it personally in Cheyenne and sent Elena a copy by fast mail. She read it at the kitchen table with the flour canister at her elbow and the bread not yet started because she'd been waiting for this letter and had not been able to think about anything else all morning. The filing was precise. It cited the Hendricks fire and described the physical evidence, the branded fence post, the pattern of the burn, the timeline relative to the Hendricks family's status as connected witnesses. It cited 2 previous incidents of property interference documented over the summer. It cited Court Bellamy's connection to Silas Vaughn's land operation. It requested an accelerated hearing date on the grounds that continued delay was creating conditions under which witnesses were being systematically intimidated and property was being destroyed. It also named, for the first time in a legal document, 14 separate families whose claims were part of the documented network. Elena read those 14 names 3 times. She knew 7 of them now personally. The other 7 she knew by their stories, the way you know people you've never met but whose lives have intersected with yours in ways that matter. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer and started the bread. 2 weeks later, on the first Friday of October, Finch's letter arrived with a hearing date, January 15th. The Territorial District Court, Cheyenne. 14 weeks. She held the letter for a moment in the kitchen light and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not quite relief, not quite anticipation, but the specific quality of a thing that has been uncertain finally becoming certain, even if what it becomes certain to be is a hard thing. She could work with hard things. Hard things had schedules. She put the letter in the drawer with the others and went to find Damien. October narrowed the days down and pulled the color out of the hills, and the work shifted from building the case to preparing to present it. Finch came to Hardin's Bluff in the second week of October. She had not expected him to make the trip, but he said he wanted to see the property, stand on the land the case was about, understand its geography in his body rather than just on paper. She took him out to the Eastern Acres on a clear, cold morning, the 2 of them and Damien walking the boundary that the 1847 survey had established, and Finch moved slowly and said almost nothing, but she could see him building something in his head. At the boundary marker, the original one, a flat stone half buried in the earth that matched the description in Holt's letters exactly. He stopped and crouched and put his hand on it. "This is how old?" he asked. "Based on the survey description, this marker was placed in 1847, Damien said. "Before the fraudulent resurvey in 1864. Finch looked at it. "Vaughn's surveyors claimed the eastern boundary ran 30 yards west of this." "Yes. 30 yards over this terrain is not a clerical error," Finch said. "Anyone who has stood here knows that." "That's what I've been trying to explain," Elena said. He stood up and looked at the land. It was not dramatic land. No cliffs, no roaring rivers. It was Wyoming ground, modest and stubborn, the kind of land that didn't offer anything easily but didn't take it back either. The kind you could build something real on if you were willing to work. "I'm going to put you on the stand," he said to Elena. Not a question. "I know. Vaughn's lawyers will try to make this about your emotions, about your grief for your grandmother, your losses with your husband's ranch. They'll try to reframe you as a woman operating from sentiment rather than evidence." "Let them try," she said. He looked at her with the particular focused attention he gave to things he was deciding about. "You'll need to be very controlled, not cold. Cold reads as hiding something, but controlled, evidence-based. The facts should carry emotion because they're true, not because you're supplying it." "I know the difference," Elena said. "I've been living in facts this whole year. I know what they feel like." He nodded, satisfied with that. He spent another hour at the property, and then they rode back. And that evening he sat at her kitchen table and went through the specific questions he intended to ask her on the stand and the likely counter-questions from Vaughn's defense. And they worked through her answers until nearly midnight, when he stood and stretched his back and said he needed to sleep. "You're ready," he said at the door. "I'll be ready in January," she said. "Ask me again then." He accepted that correction. He was, she had come to understand, a man who respected precision. After he left, she and Damien sat on the porch for a while in the cold that had come down hard after dark. The stars were out in the way they got in October, sharp and close-looking, the air so clear it felt like you could put your hand up and touch them. Are you scared? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Not of the courtroom. I'm scared of what happens if it doesn't work. Not to me, I've managed worse. But to the Hendricks family, to Mabel, to the people who came forward because we told them there was a case worth coming forward for. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that too, he said. I know you have. If we lose, I'll keep going, he said. Different approach, different angle. It doesn't end at one hearing. I know. She pulled her coat tighter. But the families who've testified, they've already shown their hands. If we lose, Vaughn knows who is willing to stand up, and he'll make sure they regret it. He'll try, Damien said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly, but the kind of cold certainty that sits below anger and lasts longer. But I'm not going to let 14 families who trusted us twist in the wind over a legal setback. I have enough resources to make it very expensive for Vaughn to go after individual witnesses. I'll spend every dollar of it if I have to. She looked at him. There it was, the thing she had understood theoretically and was hearing directly for the first time. He wasn't fighting this case because it was the right thing to do in the abstract. He was fighting it because he had decided these specific people were his responsibility, and he did not make that kind of decision lightly and did not revoke it when it became inconvenient. You're going to spend the rest of your life doing this, aren't you? She said. It wasn't quite a question. Probably, he said, even after this case is over. There'll be another one. He said it without drama. There's always another one. The mechanism doesn't go away just because one instance of it gets exposed. She thought about that, about what it meant to choose a fight that didn't have a clean ending, that would keep generating new battles as long as people with resources and corrupt intent existed. She had come into this year with a single objective: her grandmother's land, her family's restored claim, and she had been slowly, over the months, coming to understand that it was part of something larger than that, and that she could either step back to the limited thing or step forward into the larger one. I'll need to figure out the bread, she said. He looked at her. I can't sell it from the fence post if I'm in Cheyenne half the year, she said. I'll need to find a way to make it work differently. She heard him understand what she was saying, not just the logistical thing about the bread. The whole thing. What she was deciding, right here, on this porch, in October, under these particular stars. We'll figure it out, he said. Together? He looked at her in the way he had started looking at her sometime around June, the way she had noticed and not named yet. Together, he said. She nodded once and looked back at the stars. Not because the conversation was over, but because she needed a moment that was just hers, to sit with a decision that was large and clear and not entirely without fear, and feel the weight of it settle into her the way real things settle. Not lightly, not painlessly, but honestly, which was the only way she had ever trusted anything to be real. The bread would wait until morning. The stars were already there, and January was 14 weeks away, and there was still so much work to do, and she was ready to do it, and that was everything she needed to know for tonight. The 14 weeks between October and January were the fastest slow weeks Elena had ever lived through. Fast because they were full. There was always something that needed doing, always a letter from Finch requiring a response. Always a new piece of documentation to verify, or a witness statement to review, or a logistical problem to solve. Slow, because underneath all of it, January 15th sat like a stone at the bottom of a creek, immovable, and every day that passed was just another day of waiting toward it. She made arrangements for the bread. A woman named Dory Callum, who lived 2 properties over and had 4 children and a husband whose back had given out the previous spring, agreed to bake from Elena's starter and sell from the fence post on Saturdays in exchange for 60% of the proceeds. It was not an arrangement Elena loved. The starter was Ruth's, and trusting it to someone else's hands felt like lending out something that didn't fully belong to her, to lend. But Dory had good instincts, and Elena spent 3 Saturday mornings working beside her until she was confident the bread would be right. You'll be back, Dory said on the 3rd Saturday, in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than offering comfort. I'll be back, Elena said. But I don't know what back looks like yet. Dory looked at her with the practical wisdom of a woman who had managed a household on reduced means for 2 years and had stopped expecting things to look like anything in particular. Back means you're here, she said, The rest gets figured out. Elena went to Cheyenne twice in November and once in December, each time sitting across from Finch in his paper-smelling office, going through the case layer by layer. He was thorough in a way that occasionally exhausted her. He asked the same questions in different orders to see if her answers shifted, which they didn't, but which she understood was necessary. He was preparing her for what Vaughn's lawyers would do, which was exactly this, except with hostility attached. The lead attorney for Vaughn's defense, she learned in December, was a man named Harwick Crane, who had practiced territorial law for 25 years and had a reputation for taking cases he expected to win and winning them by making the opposing witnesses doubt themselves on the stand. Finch described him without drama, the way he described most things, but she noticed that he described Crane more carefully than he'd described anything else about the case. "He's good," Finch said. "Not dishonest. He doesn't need to be dishonest, which makes him harder to counter. He finds the places where your story has texture, and he presses on them until the texture looks like inconsistency." "What texture does our story have?" Elena asked. "The gap between 1864 and now. Why didn't anyone contest the resurvey at the time or in the years immediately following? He'll argue that 60 years of non-contestation implies acceptance. He'll try to make your grandmother's patience look like abandonment of the claim." "We have her notes," Elena said. "We have the deed she kept. We have the fact that she notated the survey with Harlan Voss's name. She was actively tracking the claim. Those are good answers. He'll find the places where they're not complete answers. Then help me fill the gaps." They worked through December with that specific purpose. Not just what was true, but where the truth had holes in it that could be made to look like something else, and how to address those holes directly rather than waiting for Crane to find them. Elena had learned from watching Damien that the worst thing you could do in a conflict was be surprised by something you should have anticipated. She was not going to walk into that courtroom and be surprised. Damien came to Cheyenne for the December session. He sat in Finch's office and mostly listened, which was useful because he occasionally heard things she and Finch had talked past, and said so, and both times it improved the preparation. He was not a man who spoke in meetings to demonstrate his presence. She had noticed that about him early, and continued to notice it because it was rare enough to be worth noticing. On the evening of the second December day, they had dinner at the hotel restaurant where they were both staying, which was the first time they had eaten a meal together in a setting that was not her porch or his kitchen table or a courthouse anteroom. The restaurant had tablecloths and a waiter who addressed Damien by name because he stayed there when he came to Cheyenne on business, and the whole thing felt slightly formal in a way Elena found she didn't mind as much as she would have expected. "How are you actually doing?" he asked after they had ordered and the waiter had gone. "You asked me that in October," she said. "I'm asking again." She looked at her water glass. "I'm holding together. Some days better than others." She paused. "I had a bad week in November. I kept thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, and I couldn't get it to stop." "What did you do about it?" "I baked a lot of bread and reorganized the document drawer 3 times, and eventually it stopped." She looked at him. "It's not a dignified process. Most real processes aren't." "I know. That doesn't make it less annoying." She shifted in her chair. "I also thought about Ruth a lot, about what she did with 30 years of holding this. She didn't have Finch. She didn't have documentation of Holt's letters. She didn't have you." She said the last part plainly, not loading it with anything it wasn't meant to carry. She had the deed and her own certainty that she was right and nowhere to take it. "I have it considerably better than she did, and some days it still felt like too much. I don't know how she did it." "She didn't have the option of not doing it," Damien said. "I know. Neither do you, not really." She looked at him. "I could have taken Vaughn's money in May." "Could you have?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "Not really. But I like to keep track of what the exits were, even when I'm not going to use them. It helps me know that I'm making a choice rather than just being carried." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the kind of attention that had become familiar and still occasionally made her uncertain where to look. "You've always known exactly what you were doing," he said. "Since the first Saturday you sold me bread. You were watching everything and keeping your own counsel and not asking anyone's permission for any of it." "People thought I was cold," she said. "People thought you were unreadable. That's different. Same result." Different process, he said. Cold means nothing's going on. Unreadable means there's too much going on to let any of it out where someone can use it against you. He turned his water glass slowly on the tablecloth. After Thomas, after losing the ranch, you'd learned that things you let show could be used against you. She looked at him for a long moment. When did you work that out? Probably February, he said. I've been sitting on it since then. Why didn't you say anything? Because I thought you knew it already and didn't need me confirming it, and because... He stopped, put the glass down. Because I wasn't sure it was my business yet. Yet. She registered the word without commenting on it. It sat between them on the table like the third person at dinner, and they both politely ignored it and talked about other things, and the food was fine, and the evening was fine, and when they said goodnight in the hotel corridor, she went to her room and stood at the window for a while looking out at the Cheyenne street and thought about the word yet and what it was beginning to mean. January arrived without ceremony, the way months do when you've been waiting for them, all at once, with the specific disappointment of a thing that was supposed to feel like a transition and instead just felt like the next day. Elena spent the first 2 weeks of it in Cheyenne, first in final preparation sessions with Finch, and then in the specific limbo of the days before the hearing when there was nothing left to prepare and the only thing left to do was wait for it to start. Mabel Pruitt came to Cheyenne. Elena had not expected her. The journey was long for a woman of 70, and the winter was hard. But Mabel arrived on the 12th in a heavy wool coat and sensible boots and settled into the modest hotel room Damien had arranged for her as if she had been planning to be there all along. I'm not testifying, Mabel said, at dinner the first evening, clearly preempting any suggestion that she might. My knees won't hold up to that kind of strain, and my memory isn't reliable enough for a lawyer to pick through, but I'm going to be in the room. You don't have to be, Elena said. I know I don't have to be. She cut her bread with the efficiency of someone who had been feeding herself without help for years. Abel didn't live to see this. I'm going to see it for both of us. Elena didn't argue. She understood the logic from the inside. The Hendricks brothers came, all three of them, Caleb's forearm still slightly marked from the October fire. They were not testifying either. Their case was documented but not part of this specific filing. But they had asked to attend, and Finch had no legal objection. Elena watched them settle into the courtroom gallery on the morning of the 15th and felt the particular weight of what it meant to have people in a room with you who were there because they trusted you to do something correctly. She had not allowed herself to think about that weight until this moment. She let it in now, briefly, and then she put it somewhere manageable and turned to face the front of the room. The courtroom was larger than she had expected. She had built it in her imagination as something more intimate, more proportional to the thing being argued, but it was high-ceilinged and formal, with oak paneling that had darkened over years, and a bench elevated enough that Judge Emery Cahill, when he entered, looked down at the room in the physical way that presumably reinforced whatever authority the bench was supposed to confer. Cahill was perhaps 65, white-haired, with a face that had been doing this for a long time and had learned to give nothing away. He settled into his chair with the unhurried manner of a man who had learned that patience was a professional tool. Silas Vaughn sat at the defense table with Harwick Crane and 2 associate attorneys. Vaughn looked the same as he had in May at Elena's yard, the same performed calm, the same expensive gray coat. But something was slightly different about him today. She studied him for a moment and identified it. He was not looking at her. In May, he had looked at her directly, assessed her, revised his estimate. Today, he was looking at his attorney's papers and at the judge's bench and at the windows. He was not looking at her at all. She filed that away and said nothing about it. Crane opened for the defense with a version of exactly what Finch had predicted, that the land in question had been under legitimate commercial use and development for over a decade, that the resurvey of 1864 had been conducted by a licensed territorial surveyor, that the original Callaway grant documents, while historically interesting, represented a claim that had not been actively pursued for 60 years, and that the absence of any legal contestation over that period constituted, in practical terms, an acceptance of the adjusted boundary. He was smooth about it. Elena had to grant him that. He delivered complicated legal arguments with the clarity of someone explaining something obvious, and he did it without visible condescension, which made it harder to argue against because there was no tone to object to, just the argument itself. Finch's opening was shorter. He laid out the evidence timeline: the 1847 grant, the 1864 resurvey, Holt's letters, the pattern of acquisitions, and he made one statement near the end that Elena had not heard him rehearse and that she suspected he had decided to include at the last moment. "Your Honor," he said, "the question before this court is not whether a legal mechanism was followed in 1864. The question is whether that mechanism was corrupted from the inside by the people responsible for administering it. We will show that it was. And we will show that this corruption was not a single event, but a practiced method, applied repeatedly, over decades, to families who lacked the resources or the access to understand what was being done to them until it was done." The room was quiet when he finished. Elena looked at Cahill. The judge was writing something on the papers before him and did not look up. She could not tell anything from his face. She had not expected to be able to. The first 2 days of testimony were the documentary foundation. Finch walking a series of witnesses through the chain of title, the survey records, the land office filings. It was necessary, and it was tedious, and she watched the jury the way she had been told to, looking not for agreement, but for the particular quality of attention that meant someone was following rather than enduring. 3 of the 12 jurors were following with that quality of attention. That was enough to start with. Crane's cross-examinations on those first 2 days were precise and technical. He found 2 minor dating discrepancies in the land office filings and pressed on them until they occupied more space in the room than their actual significance warranted, which Elena recognized as a technique: make the small errors look like the tip of a larger iceberg that doesn't exist. Finch re-examined each time and corrected the record clearly, but the damage was incremental, and she understood why Finch had warned her that Crane didn't need to win big, just chip. Damien testified on the 3rd day. He was on the stand for 4 hours. He was a good witness in the specific way Elena had expected. Precise, unrattled, willing to say, "I don't know," when he didn't know, which was more powerful than having an answer for everything. He walked through 3 years of his own investigation with the patience of someone who understood that a jury needed to be brought along rather than pushed. He described Abel Pruitt without sentiment, just the facts of what Abel had known, what he tried to do, what it had cost him. And the absence of sentiment made it hit harder than sentiment would have. Crane went after him for an hour and a half. He focused on the gap between Damien's personal investigation and the official legal record, trying to imply that a wealthy rancher conducting private surveillance of a land company was itself suspect, that Damien's motivation was competitive rather than principled, that he was using Elena's claim as a vehicle for a business rivalry he dressed up as a justice case. "Mr. Ashford," Crane said, leaning slightly on the rail, "you are yourself one of the largest landholders in this territory." "Yes," Damien said, "and the land in question, the Callaway Grant parcels, border property in which you have existing commercial interests." "Some of them, yes." "So a ruling in the plaintiff's favor would benefit you financially." "Marginally," Damien said. "Marginally," Crane repeated with the specific tone that was not quite a smirk. "How would you quantify marginally?" "The eastern border of my range would become clearer, which reduces a surveying cost I pay periodically. The annual value of that clarity is probably $40. Damien looked at Crane without expression. "I've spent considerably more than $40 on this investigation." A sound from the jury box, not laughter, but the shift in posture that happens when something lands. Crane moved on quickly, which told Elena it had landed for him too. Harlan Voss's son testified on the 4th day, bringing his father's files in the cedar trunk, which caused a procedural argument over admissibility that consumed most of the morning. Cahill ruled the letters admissible under the historical document exception, a ruling that Crane objected to and that Elena could see he had expected to lose but had argued anyway to establish the record. The letters went in. The reading into the record took 90 minutes. Finch read them aloud, and the room was quiet in the particular way it gets when people are listening to a dead man account for something he had done that he knew was wrong. Elena was called on the 5th day. She had slept 4 hours the night before. Not from nerves, exactly. She had moved past the nerve stage somewhere around November and had arrived at a place that was colder and cleaner, a functional state that she recognized as the same place she'd been when the foreclosure notice came and when Thomas died. The place where there was nothing left to be afraid of that was worse than the thing you were already in, and so you just did the next thing. She took the oath and sat down and looked at Finch. He walked her through it in the order they had planned. The house, her grandmother's house, which she described without embellishment. 2 rooms, the wood stove that listed left, the quarter acre. Ruth herself, her grandmother's character, her habits, the careful filing she had maintained. The deed and the survey found in the bottom drawer in Ruth's labeled envelope. She described finding the notation on the back of the survey. She described it in Ruth's exact words. Callaway Grant Land, original survey 1847. See Harlan Voss redisputed claim. In your understanding, Finch said, what does that notation tell us about your grandmother's knowledge of the claim? It tells us she knew the land had been disputed, Elena said. She kept the original survey. She wrote down the name of the surveyor she believed had information about it. She didn't write that as a memory aid. She had other memory aids, lists, dates. She wrote it as a direction, for someone who came after her. For you, Finch said. I think so, yes. Crane's cross-examination began after the lunch recess and lasted the rest of the afternoon. He was, as advertised, good. He started with Thomas, gently, almost sympathetically, establishing the losses she had experienced, the ranch, the debts, the foreclosure. He was building a picture of a woman who had suffered financial hardship and who might have motivation to find a claim to something she didn't have. Mrs. Cross, he said, you found these documents after your husband's estate was settled and the ranch was lost. Yes, and their discovery came at a moment when you were financially vulnerable. I've been financially vulnerable since March of last year, she said. The documents didn't change that. They don't resolve my finances. The land in the claim is not land I intend to farm for profit. It's land that belonged to my family and was taken. He moved on. He asked about the notation in Ruth's handwriting. He suggested carefully that a single handwritten line could be interpreted multiple ways. It could be a note about a general legal question, he said, not necessarily an assertion of ownership. She kept the original survey in the same envelope as the deed, Elena said, for 30 years. If she believed the claim was settled, why keep the survey? Perhaps she simply kept everything. She did keep everything, Elena said. Every letter, every receipt. But those were in different envelopes, labeled by date. The survey was in the deed envelope. She put them together. You're inferring her intent. I'm reading her filing system, Elena said, which I learned from her when I was 9 years old. I know how she organized things, and I know what it means when she put 2 documents in the same envelope. Crane paused fractionally. She had not raised her voice. She had answered the question he asked, and nothing more. And she watched him recalibrate. Mrs. Cross, would you describe yourself as an objective analyst of your grandmother's intentions? No, she said. I describe myself as the person who knew her best and learned her methods firsthand. Objective doesn't mean distant. It means accurate. He moved to the 60-year gap. She had been expecting this. Your grandmother had this documentation from, at the latest, the 1870s, when you believe she fully understood the nature of the claim, Crane said. She lived until last year, approximately 50 years of nothing. No filing, no legal action, no public assertion of the claim. How do you explain that? Elena was quiet for a moment. Not hesitation. She knew exactly what she was going to say. She wanted the pause to let the question sit in the room before she answered it. My grandmother was a woman of modest means in a frontier county, she said. In 1864, when the resurvey was conducted, she had no legal representation and no money to obtain any. The county recorder's office and the land office were staffed by people connected to the same network that had conducted the fraudulent resurvey. She had a piece of paper that said the land was hers and a system designed to tell her it wasn't, and she had no mechanism to make the system listen. That's a characterization, not an... Let me finish, she said. Crane stopped. The room was very quiet. She spent 50 years keeping every document she had. She found the name of the surveyor who could corroborate the fraud, and she wrote it down where her granddaughter would find it. She didn't contest the claim in court because contesting it in court in 1870 would have cost money she didn't have, before a judge appointed by the same territorial government that employed the people who had taken her land, in a county where the sheriff answered to the man who had profited from the taking. She looked at Crane steadily. What would you have had her do, Mr. Crane? The room was very quiet. Cahill said, from the bench, Mr. Crane? Crane had recovered. She would grant him that. "I'll move on, Your Honor." He asked 3 more questions, none of them carrying the weight of that one, and then he said he had nothing further and sat down. Finch stood for redirect and asked 1 question. "Mrs. Cross, you said your grandmother wrote the notation on the survey as a direction for someone who came after her. In your judgment, having known her for 27 years, was she a woman who gave up on things that mattered to her?" Elena looked at the jury. Not strategically. She had not been told to do that, but because the answer was about a person they needed to understand. "No," she said. "She was the most patient person I have ever known. Patient in the specific way that means you believe you're right, and you're willing to wait as long as it takes for the world to catch up with that." Finch said, "Thank you, Mrs. Cross," and sat down. She stepped down from the stand. Her legs were steady. She had not been certain they would be. She returned to the plaintiff's table and sat beside Finch and looked forward, not at Vaughn, not at the gallery. She could feel the room behind her. Mabel Pruitt, the Hendricks brothers, Damien's particular quality of stillness, and she did not turn around because she did not need to. She knew they were there. That was enough. The closing arguments came 2 days later, on the 7th of the proceedings. Finch closed for 40 minutes. Crane closed for 55. Finch had told her longer closings were sometimes a sign of insecurity and sometimes just a sign of a thorough attorney, and she had no way of knowing which this was. What she knew was this. Finch's 40 minutes were the clearest 40 minutes of organized thought she had ever listened to a person deliver. He took every element they had built and laid it out in an order that moved from the specific to the general and back again, and he ended with something she had not written for him and had not heard him rehearse. "The court has before it 60 years of wrong," he said. "Not 60 years of accident, not 60 years of clerical error, but 60 years of deliberate, systematic, profitable wrong. Designed by people who understood exactly what they were doing, executed by people who were paid to understand it, and sustained by a system that made the truth nearly impossible to reach." He looked at the jury. Ruth Calloway kept the truth in a drawer for 50 years because that was the only safe place for it. Her granddaughter brought it into this room. What you do with it is the only question left. The jury was out for 6 hours. Elena spent those 6 hours in an anteroom with Finch and Damien and no one else. Mabel and the Hendricks brothers had gone to find food, and she had not felt able to eat. She sat in a wooden chair by the window and watched the Cheyenne Street and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she had developed this year by necessity. Damien sat across from her. At some point in the 4th hour, he moved his chair beside hers rather than across from it, not saying anything, just moving, and she let him, and they sat together in the gray January light and waited for the word to come. It came at 4:30. The jury filed in, and Elena watched their faces and saw nothing, which Finch had told her was normal and which she found agony. Cahill read the procedural statement, which took longer than it needed to. She was aware of her own breathing in a very specific way. Then Cahill said, "On the primary claim of fraudulent survey and wrongful dispossession of the Calloway grant parcel, the jury finds for the plaintiff." She heard Mabel Pruitt make a sound behind her. Not loud. A small, controlled sound, the kind that happens when you have been holding something for a very long time and it finally puts itself down. Cahill continued. Vaughn's fraudulent claims were invalidated. The land was to be restored to its rightful title. A federal referral would be issued to investigate the broader network, the other families, the other parcels, the documented pattern. She was aware that Damien had his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. She was not sure when that had happened. She did not move it. Vaughn stood at the defense table with the expression of a man who had been certain and was now revising that certainty under conditions he had not prepared for. Crane was speaking quietly in his ear. Vaughn did not look at Elena. He still had not looked at her, not once in 7 days. She looked at him, not with triumph. That would have felt cheap against the weight of what had brought them here. She looked at him the way you look at something that is now behind you, clearly, without flinching, and then you move forward. The courtroom began to reorganize itself around the verdict, and she stood up from her chair and turned to the gallery, and Mabel was there with her careful eyes and her strong hands, and the Hendricks brothers were there, Caleb nodding once, just once, and she nodded back. And behind them the gallery was full of people she didn't know who had been drawn by the case and would now carry its result somewhere she couldn't follow. Outside, the January air was cold and clean, and the sky was the specific pale blue of winter in Wyoming that she had looked at her whole life and never quite been able to describe. "It's not over," she said to Damien, standing on the courthouse steps. "No," he agreed. "The federal referral takes time. The Pruitt claim isn't filed yet. The other families—" "I know," she said. "I know all of that." She looked at the sky. "I just mean the whole thing. It's not a clean ending." "No," he said. "It's not. But it's something. It's a great deal," he said quietly. She stood there for another moment, breathing the cold air, feeling the ground solid under her feet, thinking about Ruth's drawer and Holt's letters, and Mabel's cedar trunk, and Abel Pruitt, and the borrowed years it had taken to get a truth from a bottom drawer into a courtroom and out the other side as a verdict. It was not clean. It was not complete. There were things in it she could not undo and fights still ahead that she hadn't fully mapped. But it was real, and it was hers. And standing on the courthouse steps with the cold coming in off the plains and Damien beside her and the fight still going, she understood that real and hers and still going were the three things she had wanted all along. The federal referral moved slower than anyone had hoped and faster than anyone had reasonably expected, which meant it moved at the pace of a government process that had been given actual teeth by a verdict it couldn't ignore. Elena came home from Cheyenne on the 18th of January, 3 days after the ruling, on a stage that was cold and badly sprung and stopped twice for reasons the driver didn't explain. She arrived in Hardin's Bluff after dark with her bag and her coat and the particular hollow exhaustion of someone who has been holding enormous tension for a long time and has just put it down and doesn't quite know yet how to stand without it. Dory Callum had left a lamp burning in the window, which Elena had not asked her to do, and which nearly undid her in a way the entire 7 days of trial had not. She set her bag down inside the door and stood in the kitchen for a while without taking her coat off, just standing in the familiar space, the listed wood stove, the flour canister, the drawer with its months of careful documents, and let the house settle around her. The deed to the 40 acres was being formally re-registered in her name. Finch had told her it would take 6 to 8 weeks for the paperwork to complete its journey through the Territorial Land Office, which was the same land office that had spent the better part of a year being an obstacle, and which was now, under the scrutiny of a federal referral and a very public verdict, being considerably more cooperative about moving things along. She would believe the 6 to 8 weeks when she had the paper in her hand. Until then, she held it as probable and moved forward accordingly, which was the only way she knew to operate. She took her coat off. She started a fire in the stove. She fed Ruth's starter, which Dory had kept alive but which had gone slightly thin from the cold, and she made a note to adjust the feeding schedule for the next 2 weeks until it came back to full strength. These were small actions, practical, requiring nothing from her except attention to the thing directly in front of her, and she was grateful for them in the way you are grateful for anything that asks only the simple version of you when the complicated version is tired. She slept 9 hours, which she had not done since October. The town's response to the verdict arrived in stages, the way the town's responses to things always did, and she tracked it with the same careful attention she had always given it. Not because it mattered to what she was going to do, but because understanding the place you live is a form of self-defense, and she had learned that the hard way. The first stage was silence. For about 4 days after she returned, Hardin's Bluff was oddly quiet around her while. Not hostile, not warm, just quiet, the way a room gets when the people in it are recalculating and haven't finished yet. She went to the market road on the Saturday after her return, standing beside Dory in the cold with the bread she'd baked herself for the first time in 3 months, and people came and bought it and said good morning and didn't say much else. She was fine with that. She had not done this for the town's approval, and she did not need it now. The second stage was Margaret Teller. Margaret came on a Tuesday to the house, which was unusual. Margaret communicated through the market road and the dry goods store and the layered social geography of the town, not through direct visits to someone's front door. She knocked and Elena opened it, and they looked at each other for a moment. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said. Elena studied her. Margaret Teller was not someone who apologized easily, and Elena could tell from the set of her jaw that this was costing her something. "Come in," Elena said. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Margaret said what she had apparently come to say. that she had been wrong in what she'd implied about Elena's motivations with Damien and wrong in what she'd said about the lawsuit being a grief-driven mistake, and she wanted Elena to know that she understood that now. Elena was quiet for a moment after Margaret finished. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Elena said. "Yes." "Do you actually believe you were wrong, or do you believe I won and you want to be on the right side of it?" Margaret's mouth went tight. Then, unexpectedly, she let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "Both," she said. "Does that disqualify the apology?" Elena thought about it. "No," she said. "Honesty makes it better, actually." They didn't become close after that, but something shifted between them into a category that was more useful than what it had been, and Elena accepted that as the realistic version of reconciliation, which is rarely the clean kind but is still worth having. The third stage was the harder one, the people who didn't come to apologize and didn't acknowledge the shift, and simply went on as before, neither hostile nor warm, just the same. She had known which ones they would be, and she had been right. She released them without ceremony. She had spent a year learning that you cannot carry other people's recalcitrance along with your own work, and she applied that lesson here as she had applied it everywhere else. What surprised her was Gerald Hatch. Gerald Hatch, the first man who had proposed to her, the one she had recognized as looking for a housekeeper, came to the fence post one Saturday in February and bought bread and stood there for a moment longer than buying bread required. "My wife used to make something like this," he said. "Different recipe, but the same. I don't know. The same feeling to it." She hadn't known he'd had a wife. She had known him as a widower for as long as she could remember, which was a failure of attention she recognized in herself. "How long ago?" she said. 12 years. He turned the loaf over in his hands the way Damien had turned that first loaf, the first Saturday. When I asked you last year, I wasn't thinking about what you'd want. I was thinking about what I needed. I know that." She looked at him. He was not asking for anything, which made it easier to hear. "I know you were," she said. "I didn't hold it against you." "You didn't say that at the time." "No," she agreed, "but I thought it." He almost smiled. He paid for the bread and left, and she watched him go and thought about the 12 years and the wife and the fact that grief made people selfish in ways they sometimes eventually understood, which was as much as you could ask for, really. 1. The federal investigation into Vaughn's network moved through February and March with the grinding persistence of a large thing that has been set in motion and cannot easily be stopped. 2 federal agents came to Hardin's Bluff in late February and spent 3 days interviewing people, including Elena, including Damien, including the Hendricks brothers, and including, by correspondence because the journey was too far, Mabel Pruitt. The agents were professional and impersonal and wrote everything down in small notebooks and did not tell anyone what they were thinking, which was either good practice or bad news, and Elena decided to treat it as good practice and move forward. Silas Vaughn's land company filed for a continuance in the federal proceedings in March, which Finch told her was expected and would be denied. Court Bellamy, who had been Vaughn's primary local instrument, quietly left Hardin's Bluff sometime in the second week of February. No announcement, no explanation, just gone one day and the house he'd rented sitting empty. She took that as information without being sure exactly what it was information about. Finch filed for the Pruitt land in March, as Elena had promised Mabel he would. It was a separate case, narrower in scope, with a cleaner title chain, and Finch said privately that he expected it to resolve faster than the Calloway case had. Mabel received the letter informing her of the filing with the same settled manner she received most things. She wrote back to Elena thanking her and saying she intended to plant tomatoes this spring regardless of how long the legal process took, because you couldn't wait on a garden any more than you could wait on a verdict. Elena read that letter at the kitchen table and felt something she had been feeling more frequently in the months since the verdict, which was a kind of grateful tiredness, not the hollow exhaustion of the immediate aftermath. Something more layered, the specific feeling of a person who has been carrying weight and has put some of it down and can now feel exactly how heavy it was, which you can't always feel while you're still carrying it. She had put some things down. She had picked other things up. The net weight was probably about the same, but it was distributed differently, and different distribution changed everything about how you walked. Damien came for dinner in February, not on a pretext, not to look at a fence or discuss a legal question, just for dinner, which they had been doing once a week since they returned from Cheyenne, taking turns at each other's kitchens with a naturalness that had arrived so gradually she hadn't been able to identify the moment it started. This particular evening, she had made a stew that hadn't quite come together the way she'd intended. The potatoes too soft, the broth thinner than she wanted. And she put it on the table without apologizing for it, because she had decided early in this dinner arrangement that apologizing for imperfect food was a performance she wasn't going to do. He ate it without comment on its flaws, which she appreciated. He said it was good, which was a slight overstatement, which she also appreciated because it was the overstatement of someone being kind rather than the overstatement of someone who wasn't paying attention. They talked about the federal investigation for a while, and then about the ranch. He had a problem with a section of fence along the northern pasture that was going to require significant work before spring, and she had opinions about the most efficient approach that turned out to be mostly right, which he acknowledged without making a production of it. At some point in the middle of the evening, in a pause between topics, he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him across the table. "Not about the case," he said. "Not about the land. Something else." "All right." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet before things that mattered to him. Not stalling, just making sure he was going to say it right. "I've been thinking about what this looks like," he said, "going forward. The investigations, the new filings, what we're building. And I've been thinking about it as we. Not as two separate people who are cooperating, as we." She held very still in the specific way she went still when she was paying close attention to something. "I'm not asking you to leave what you have here," he said. "Your house. Ruth's place. The bread. The market road. The things you've built this year. I'm not asking you to trade one life for a bigger one." He looked at the table briefly and then back at her. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to let what's already happening between us be what it is, without either of us pretending it isn't happening." She was quiet for a moment. "What is it?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "You know what it is. I want to hear you say it. I love you," he said. "I've been working out how to say that since about June, and I haven't found a way to say it that doesn't sound either too small or too large for the actual thing, so I'm just saying it." She looked at him for a long time. She was aware of the stew going cold and the stove ticking and the lamp making the kitchen warm and yellow at the edges, and of Damien across the table with his hands flat and his face as honest as she had ever seen a face be. "I'm not easy," she said. "I know. I make decisions without consulting people. I hold things close until I understand them. I'm not going to become different because someone loves me." "I don't want you to become different," he said. "I want you exactly as you are. The holding close and the independent deciding. And all of it. I'm not asking you to soften. I'm asking if there's room." She thought about Thomas, not painfully. Thomas lived in a different room of her now, not the one she was sitting in, and she could think about him without the thought colonizing everything. She thought about what she had wanted from marriage when she was young, which was someone to share the weight with, and about what she had gotten, which was someone who had quietly added to the weight without telling her. She thought about what this year had taught her about the difference between being needed and being chosen, and about how Damien had chosen her specifically, not because she was available or convenient or in distress, but because she was herself, exactly, including the parts that made her difficult. "There's room," she said. He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for some time. "But I need you to understand something," she said. "I'm not going to be a version of this that looks the way people expect it to look. I'm not moving into the big ranch house and becoming the rancher's wife who stands at the social events. That's not what I'm built for. I know that. And the bread is mine. The work I do, the cases, the families, the documentation, that's mine too. It's not auxiliary to what you're doing. It's not support work." "I know that too," he said. "Elena, I've been watching you work for a year. I know exactly who you are and what you do and what it costs you and what it's worth. I'm not asking you to stand behind me. I'm asking you to stand next to me. Those are different things." She looked at him for another long moment, and what she felt was not the dizzy, ungrounded thing she had expected love to feel like at 28. That had been Thomas, young and hurried and not fully looked at. This was something more deliberate, more chosen, more clear-eyed about what it actually was and what it would actually require. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. Don't make it into a larger moment than it is, she said, because she could see him wanting to. I'm not, he said, smiling slightly. I'm just sitting here. Good, she said. The stew's cold. I'll heat it up. She got up and took the pot back to the stove and stood with her back to him for a moment, and she was smiling too, though she didn't turn around to show it because some things you're allowed to keep for yourself. But April came, and with it the formal re-registration of the Callaway Grant land in Elena Cross's name. The document arrived by post in a plain envelope from the Territorial Land Office, and she opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with flour on her hands because she had been mid-loaf when she heard the post rider and had come in without cleaning up. She read it twice. It said what it was supposed to say. She set it down on the table and left a small flower handprint on the corner, which she noticed and decided not to correct. 43 acres. The house and the original quarter acre, plus the 40 that Ruth had held in memory for 50 years, and passed forward to the granddaughter she'd trained to hold things with patience. She sat with it for a while. The house was quiet, and the bread was in the oven, and outside the first real warmth of spring was softening the ground, and she sat in her grandmother's kitchen, in her grandmother's house on her grandmother's land, and felt the full weight of what it meant to receive something that was always yours. There is a thing that happens when you have spent a long time fighting for something and then get it. A pause. A moment where you expect it to feel larger and instead feel very quiet. It is not disappointment. It is more like the particular stillness that follows a long piece of music. Not the absence of something, but the presence of something that needs a moment to settle before you can hear it properly. She let it settle. Then she got up and took the bread out of the oven. Damien came that afternoon. She had not sent word. He had simply come, which was how things worked between them now, without a great deal of ceremony around the scheduling. He walked in and saw the document on the table and looked at her. It came, he said, this morning. He picked it up and read it, not because he didn't trust her read, but because he was someone who needed to see things directly. And then he set it down carefully. 43 acres, he said. Ruth's original survey was slightly off. The actual parcel is 3 acres larger than the 1847 document stated. She paused. Finch says that happens with old surveys. The measurement tools were imprecise. You're not complaining, he said. No, she agreed. He looked at the flower handprint on the corner of the document. You were baking when it arrived. I didn't want to stop mid-loaf. He looked at her with the expression she had been seeing for months now. The one she had finally stopped trying to look away from. What do you want to do with it? The land. It was the question she had been turning over for months, working it like the sourdough starter, testing it to see what it would become. Some of it will stay as it is, she said. The eastern boundary is pasture land. I've been talking to the Hendricks brothers. Caleb thinks he can run a small herd on it for a share of the proceeds, which would give him room to rebuild after the barn and give me income from land I can't work myself. She looked at the document. A piece of it, maybe 5 acres, the section closest to the house, I want to put under cultivation. A proper garden, something Ruth always talked about having and never quite had room for. And the rest? The rest I want to leave, she said. Just land. Not for profit, not for anything, just existing the way it's supposed to exist. He nodded. He didn't try to optimize it or suggest a better economic use. She had known he wouldn't. There's something else, she said. Finch has been approached by 2 more families in Cotter County. Same mechanism. Fraudulent resurvey, documents disappearing from the county recorder's office. Different specific players, but the same network. She looked at him. I told him to take the cases. At our expense, Damien said. At our expense, she confirmed. Is that all right? You already decided it was, he said. You're telling me, not asking me. I'm telling you because it affects your money and you deserve to know, not because I need permission. She held his gaze. But I want to know if you object. I don't object, he said. I was going to suggest the same thing by the end of the week. I know, she said. I wanted to say it first. He smiled. It was the real smile. The one that happened when she did something that confirmed whatever it was he had decided about her. She had started to recognize it and had stopped feeling self-conscious about recognizing it. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. Porter Dill's at the Gazette. He's been holding the full story since September. He wants to print it, all of it, the network, the mechanism, the other families, the verdict. He thinks it might reach Cheyenne, maybe further. That was the agreement, Damien said. The agreement was after the verdict, she said. The verdict was in January. I've been holding him to a slower timeline because I wanted the federal investigation to have ground before the public story ran. Finch thinks now is right. What do you think? I think Vaughn has been quiet for 3 months, and quiet people with resources are usually planning something, and a public story in print makes it considerably harder to plan something quietly. She looked at the table. I also think the other families, the ones who haven't come forward yet, in other counties, who don't know there's a case to come forward to, they need to be able to find us. Print does that. Damien was quiet for a moment. When? I told Dills next week. If you have concerns, I can push it. No concerns, he said. Next week. She nodded. She wrote to Dills that evening, and his story ran the following Thursday, and it ran in the Cheyenne paper the following Tuesday, and by the end of April, Finch had been contacted by 11 additional families. Tusk. The Pruitt land ruling came in May, faster than any of them had expected. Finch had been right about the narrower, cleaner case. 6 weeks from filing to ruling, and the ruling was unambiguous. The parcel was restored to Mabel Pruitt's legal possession. Elena was in her garden when Damien rode up with the letter from Finch, and she came to the fence with dirt on her knees and her hands and read it standing there in the May sun. And then she sat down on the fence post and put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying, just covering herself for a second while she felt the size of it. Mabel would get the letter the same day, by the same post. Elena thought about her sitting in her 2-room house with the letter in her strong, careful hands. And she thought about Abel Pruitt, who had worked on this until his heart gave out. And she thought about the particular cruelty of being right and not living to see it acknowledged. There is nothing to be done about that. It is one of the things that is genuinely true and genuinely unfair and cannot be resolved by any verdict or legal process or amount of patience. The world does not always wait for the right person to be present when the right thing finally happens. You can be furious about that, or you can carry what they couldn't carry to the place they were trying to reach. And the carrying is the only form of answer available. She wrote to Mabel that afternoon, not about the ruling, but Mabel would have the letter from Finch. She wrote about Abel, about what she understood now of what he had tried to do, about the cedar trunk and the letters, and the long Saturday she and Damien had spent with Mabel going through them. She wrote that she thought Abel had known, on some level, that he wouldn't finish it himself, that the leaving of the letters in a locked box was its own kind of deliberate, its own kind of faith that the right person would come eventually. She was not certain all of that was true, but she believed it, and sometimes what you believe about a thing is the most honest version of the thing you have available. Mabel wrote back in June. The letter was short. It said, I planted tomatoes. They're doing well. Thank you for what you did for him. He would have liked you. Elena put the letter in the drawer with the deed and the survey and all the rest, and she closed the drawer and went to start the morning bread. The summer settled into something she had not had in a long time, which was a rhythm that was hers, genuinely, structurally, sustainably hers, not surviving towards something or fighting towards something, but simply living in a way she had designed. She baked 3 mornings a week instead of every day. She sold bread to Dory Callum at a wholesale price and let Dory run the fence post sales, which freed Elena's Saturdays for the documentation work she was doing with Finch, compiling the cases, corresponding with the new families, building the evidentiary framework that the federal investigation was drawing on. It was not glamorous work. It was reading and writing and cross-referencing and occasional rides to interview people who had stories that needed to be told carefully. She was good at it. She had always been good at exactly this, and she had spent most of her life not knowing it because no one had put her in a position to find out. Caleb Hendricks brought a small herd onto the eastern pasture in June, and it went well enough in the first month that he was talking about expanding in the fall. His forearms had healed cleanly. He did not talk about the barn fire much, which she understood. Some things you move past by moving past them, not by processing them into the ground. The barn was rebuilt. The herd was on the land. That was the answer to the fire that mattered. Damien was at her table most evenings, and she was at his some of them. The arrangement had not been formally defined. They were not people who formally defined things when the thing was working clearly enough to not require definition. What it was this. Two people who had spent a year fighting side by side and had discovered in each other something worth staying for, and who were staying in the practical daily sense of choosing it over and over without ceremony. It was not uncomplicated. He had opinions about her pace of work that occasionally shaded into concern, and once into an argument that lasted 2 days before they worked through it. She had reactions to his instinct for control. He was used to managing large systems, and sometimes managed her by accident, and she pushed back every time. And he was getting better at catching himself, and she was getting better at not treating a mistake as a pattern. They were not the best versions of themselves with each other all the time. Some evenings they were tired and short, and the conversation was flat. Some mornings she didn't want to see anyone, including him, and she said so, and he went home. Real things are like that. The ones that aren't are not real things. What Elena had learned in the year between Thomas's debts and this June morning, standing at the garden fence with the tomatoes coming in, with 43 acres registered in her name, with Damien's horse in her yard and bread in her oven, and 11 families working their way toward reclaimed land through a legal framework she had helped build, was that survival and living were not the same activity, and that for a long time she had confused them. She had been very good at surviving. She had treated every year of her adult life as a problem to be managed, a deficit to be covered, a threat to be neutralized. She had gotten so efficient at the management that she had started to mistake it for the life itself, started to think that endurance was the point, that getting through things was the highest available standard. It wasn't. Getting through things was the floor, not the ceiling. The ceiling was something else, harder to name, less instinctive, requiring a different kind of courage than the grinding courage of endurance. It required you to want things, specific things, for yourself, not just the absence of bad things. To say this is what I am building and mean it as something other than a defensive structure. To let people in, not because you need them to survive, but because a life without them in it is smaller than the life you actually want. She had been afraid of that for a long time. She understood now that the fear was reasonable, right? She had been hurt in specific ways that made wanting things dangerous, because wanted things could be taken. But the answer to that was not to want nothing. The answer was to want clearly, with your eyes open, knowing the risk, and choose it anyway. Ruth had known this. Ruth had kept 40 acres in memory for 50 years, not because she needed the acres, but because letting the theft stand was letting something be true that wasn't true. And Ruth had been unwilling to let false things be true, even when there was nothing she could immediately do about them. That was not grief, or stubbornness, or an old woman's inability to move on. That was a refusal to revise the truth downward just because the truth was inconvenient to hold. Elena was her grandmother's granddaughter. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when Ruth was alive, when she had loved her without fully seeing her. You sometimes have to become a person before you can recognize the person who made you one. On a Saturday in late July, she was at the market road with bread when Damien came by in a way that was not coincidental. He had timed it, she could tell, which meant he had something specific to say. He waited until Dory had gone and the last customer of the morning had moved on, and then he came and stood at the fence and looked at her. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "All right, not a legal thing, not a case thing." He looked at the fence post for a moment. "I've been thinking about the ranch, about how it's structured. I have 30,000 acres and I run it with a foreman and 12 hands, and I spend half my time on legal work that has nothing to do with cattle." He looked at her. "I want to bring someone in to run the operational side, which would mean I'm more available to do the work we're doing." "You have someone in mind?" she said. "Caleb Hendricks." She considered that. "He's been running 50 head on my eastern pasture for 6 weeks. "He's good," Damien said. "You know he's good. He's organized and he's honest and he doesn't cut corners when he thinks no one's watching, which is the only test that actually matters. He'd need to hire his brothers." "I was assuming that." She looked at her breadbasket. "That's a significant thing to offer someone whose barn you couldn't prevent from being burned." "I know," Damien said quietly. "I've thought about that. I can't undo the barn. I can offer him something real going forward." She nodded slowly. It was the right thing. It was also characteristically him, not dramatic about it, not positioning it as restitution or charity, just a practical decision that happened to be fair to a person who had been treated unfairly. He was like that. He did right things in a way that didn't require the doing to be noticed, which was rarer than it should have been. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "The house." He paused. "My house is 3 miles from your house. I ride back and forth and it's fine, but I spend a lot of time on a horse between 2 places where I want to be." He looked at her directly. "I'm not asking you to come to the ranch house. I told you I wouldn't ask that. But I'm wondering if you'd be willing to think about something in between." "In between," she said. "There's a piece of ground on the southeastern corner of my range. It borders your eastern pasture, actually, which I only fully realized last month when I was redoing the survey maps. It's about 3 miles from your house and 3 miles from mine, and there's nothing on it, and I've been thinking about whether you'd want to build on it." He said it carefully, like a man who has thought about how to say something for a while and is trying to say it exactly right. "Not instead of your house. Your house is Ruth's house, and it stays yours. But a place that's neither mine nor yours. That's ours." She looked at him for a long moment. The July morning was warm, and the market road was empty, and the cottonwoods at the edge of town were full and green and making their sound in the light wind, and she thought about what he was actually proposing, which was not a building, but a life. A specific, deliberate, eyes-open life, built on ground that was neither the house she'd inherited nor the empire he'd constructed, but something new that they would have to build together from nothing, which was the only kind of thing that actually belonged to both people equally. "That's the southeastern corner that shares a boundary with my eastern pasture," she said. "Yes." "Which means if we put a house there, I can walk to Ruth's place in 20 minutes. 22, he said. "I timed it." She looked at him. He had timed it. Of course he had timed it. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Will you build something with me?" It was not an elaborate question. It did not dress itself up or reach for language bigger than what it meant. It was exactly the size of the thing it was asking. "Yes," she said. He nodded once with the particular contained quality of a man who is very glad and has decided to be quiet about it. She turned back to the breadbasket. There were 2 loaves left from the morning, slightly cooled, the crust just past its crispest, but still good. She picked one up. "Take this," she said. "I have bread at home." "Take it anyway." She held it out and he took it, and their hands were both on it for a moment in the way hands sometimes are when something is passed between people, and neither of them has let go yet. Then he took it, and she let go, and she picked up the basket and walked back up the road toward Ruth's house, her house, with the July light coming through the cottonwoods in pieces, and the eastern pasture visible through the trees with Caleb Hendricks's small herd moving slowly across it, and 43 acres of her family's land solid and real and registered under her name, and the drawer full of documents and letters that had taken 30 years and one long, hard fight to become what they had always been, true. She did not feel like a woman who had won something. She felt like a woman who had stopped letting false things be true and had found out that was enough, and more than enough, and was in fact the only foundation on which anything real could be built. The bread was good that morning. It was not her best batch. She had burned the bottom of one loaf slightly, and the crumb of another was tighter than she wanted. But it was honest bread, made from Ruth's starter, in Ruth's kitchen, by a woman who had learned that you do not wait for the perfect conditions to make something worth making. You start with what you have. You pay attention. You keep the culture alive. And eventually, not easily, not without loss, not without the kind of patience that costs something real, what you've tended becomes what you intended, and you stand in the middle of the life you built, and you understand that the building was the point all along.